The sweltering August morning of 2015 began with an unusual commotion on Pine Ridge Road in Sarasota, Florida. Four unmarked police cars quietly pulled up in front of an old, silver-painted single-story house nestled in a quiet neighborhood. Neighbors peeked through their curtains as tactical-geared officers fanned out to surround both the front and back of the home. Inside, 41-year-old Daniel Mercer was brewing his morning coffee, a routine he had maintained consistently over a decade of quiet work at a local garage. A loud and insistent knock sounded at 7:32 a.m. Daniel Mercer, Florida State Police. "We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the 2004 disappearance of Marina Lopez and Tessa Caldwell." One officer later recounted that Mercer's hand trembled slightly as he set his mug down on the kitchen counter. But his face remained strangely calm, as if he had been waiting for this moment for over a decade. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. The summer of 2004 in Fort Walton Beach always carried the distinctive humidity of the Gulf of Mexico coast, an atmosphere laced with the scent of sea salt and the sound of cars rumbling all night on Highway 98. Marina Lopez, 22, and Tessa Caldwell, 23, left their small apartment on what seemed like an ordinary evening, getting into the car together and heading toward Pensacola to attend a warehouse party that friends had been talking about all week. Inside the stifling warehouse converted into a party space, electronic music bounced off the metal walls, strobe lights flashed continuously, creating alternating patches of light and shadow. The smells of fog machines, perfume, and old wooden floors mingled, making the entire space pulse amid the heat and drum beats. Those present that night later vaguely recalled seeing Marina and Tessa standing near the makeshift bar area, chatting with a man who introduced himself as Robert Mason. His confident manner of speaking drew attention, but no one could clearly remember his face. Not long after, they drifted away from the crowd, heading toward the warehouse door. The light spilling in from the back lot was just enough to see the silhouettes of the two women fading across the open yard before disappearing toward the parking area. From that moment, no one ever saw them again. By the next morning, Marina and Tessa's bedroom remained untouched, as if they had never left. The beds were undisturbed, clothes unchanged, everything unnaturally silent. The first calls from friends rang unanswered. Their phones lit up, but no one picked up. As noon passed in confusion and unease, by afternoon, that prolonged silence turned into genuine fear. By the end of the day, with neither Marina nor Tessa returning and no further signs of contact, their families were forced to report their disappearance to the police. Just minutes after the call, the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office took the report and asked the families to come directly to headquarters to complete the official missing persons report. As the two families entered the reception area, faces dazed, voices breaking, the investigators immediately understood this was not a case of someone temporarily out of touch. Marina and Tessa were both adults, with no history of running away, no personal conflicts or mental health issues, making the case more concerning than usual from the very start. The lead investigator recorded detailed descriptions of each woman's appearance: hair color, height, the small tattoo on Tessa's wrist, the earrings Marina usually wore, along with the outfits they had on the night before, details that could become crucial if any other witnesses emerged later. The families also provided vehicle registration and information about Marina's blue sedan, the car the two often used for work or outings, but that morning it was still parked in the lot next to the apartment, proving they hadn't left town in their own vehicle. This made the atmosphere in the reception area heavy. If the two women hadn't used their personal car, it meant they had left the warehouse in some way that no one currently knew. The investigator noted the planned route from the night before, from Fort Walton Beach to Pensacola, attending a warehouse party, then returning home by morning, all consistent with what friends had said, with no signs of anything unusual before they vanished. The police's first verification step was to call the warehouse to confirm Marina and Tessa had actually been there, and the call was quickly corroborated by the venue caretaker. He clearly remembered a night that was busier than usual, remembered two standout young women, and recalled seeing them leave the area while the event was still ongoing. The investigators noted the approximate time the two left the back lot, based on witness descriptions, while requesting the organizers to list everyone who had worked that night for further verification later. At this point, headquarters had uncovered no signs indicating a crime, no evidence of a fight, no witnesses reporting arguments, no belongings left behind, and the victim's phone still rang normally as if simply forgotten somewhere. Under 2004 regulations, investigators couldn't immediately classify the case as requiring an urgent search without specific evidence. But based on the available data, two adults completely incommunicado for over a day, not returning home, not using their personal vehicle, and last seen in a crowded, hard-to-control environment, the police decided to open official missing persons files for both Marina Lopez and Tessa Caldwell. As soon as the files were activated, the investigators' first step was to return to the warehouse in Pensacola, the last place the two were seen on the lively night before they disappeared. That afternoon, the warehouse looked completely different from the chaotic party scene. No more flashing lights, no more bass thumping against the walls, just an empty building with the smell of cooled metal and faint black streaks on the floor, recalling the traces of dozens of shoes stomping hard the night before. Investigators Carson and Hale approached the venue caretaker, a middle-aged man who had been present throughout the event. He reaffirmed the preliminary details he'd given over the phone. Yes, the two young women were there that night, and yes, they left together, first blending into the back lot, then heading toward the parking area on the right side of the warehouse. Carson asked for a more specific description of the scene, but the caretaker only remembered seeing them from a distance, not noticing if they left with anyone, or if there was any argument. However, he mentioned something he hadn't brought up in the phone call. At the makeshift bar, he saw the two women standing with a strange man who was dressed more neatly than the surrounding crowd, and they talked for quite a while. When Carson asked if he'd overheard anything from the conversation, the man shook his head. The music was so loud that voices couldn't be distinguished, but he clearly remembered the way the man stood slightly leaned, hands in pockets, gaze focused more on Marina than Tessa. The next witnesses were three bartenders who worked that night, each with different vantage points, but sharing one common detail: the image of the two women laughing and talking with a man who introduced himself as Robert Mason. One staff member said he paid for drinks in cash, spoke in a polished manner, seeming like someone who had lived in Miami for a long time, and was friendly in a way that made it hard to decline conversation. Another bartender clearly remembered that when he handed over a business card, Marina took it, looked at it, then folded it and put it in her pocket without saying anything more. When Carson asked if they still had a copy of the card, the bartender regretfully shook her head. The temporary bar was cleared out right after the event, and most drop papers were collected and thrown away. The investigator asked everyone to describe the man calling himself Mason, but the results were fragmented. Some remembered him as tall, others as average height. Some described dark hair slicked back, others said the flashing lights made hair color hard to discern. Some insisted he wore a dark shirt. Others were sure he had a light jacket. This information prevented Carson from building a viable composite. But there was one point everyone agreed on. He talked with Marina and Tessa for quite a long time, longer than a stranger would typically spend with two people just met at a chaotic event. Carson and Hale scoured the back lot, where witnesses said they had seen the women pass through. It was a concrete yard with stains from rain and engine oil, leading to a wide parking area. In the pale afternoon light, nothing remained from the previous night's frenzy, except a few pieces of trash blown into the corner by the wind. There were no cameras in the back lot, nor any facing the parking area, which was quite common in industrial zones in 2004. Carson carefully examined possible entry and exit points for physical traces, but nothing made them linger. Leaving the warehouse with scattered notes about the man calling himself Robert Mason, Carson and Hale returned to Fort Walton Beach to pursue the next critical piece, gathering statements from those who knew the victims, people who could help pinpoint the exact time they left the apartment and what happened beforehand. The first person they met was Jenna, Marina, and Tessa's roommate. The small apartment was on the second floor of an old building, with the familiar feel of young people living transiently. Wall posters, nearly wilted potted plants, a kitchen counter piled with unwashed cups and glasses. Jenna said that the afternoon before the incident, both women were in good spirits, discussing the warehouse party that friends said would be more fun than any party they'd ever been to. Marina was the one who suggested leaving early to avoid traffic on the Pensacola stretch, while Tessa laughed as she picked out her outfit, showing no signs of personal issues or conflicts. Jenna clearly remembered the sound of Marina's heeled shoes as they walked out the door, then Tessa's laughter echoing from the hallway. There were no signs they were in a hurry, nor any actions suggesting they were going anywhere other than the planned party. When Carson asked if it was possible the two had spontaneously left town for somewhere farther, Jenna immediately denied it. She said they had left behind spare wallets, work clothes, and some important documents in the apartment, circumstances completely inconsistent with any intentional disappearance. Marina had even left her laptop open to a design she was working on for a client, something she never neglected for more than a day. They went out to party, not to run away, Jenna said firmly, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. The two investigators went on to meet three other close friends: Gabe, who had spoken with Marina on the phone that afternoon; Kelsey, who often worked the same shifts as Tessa; and Aaron, who had planned to meet Marina the next morning for work matters. All painted the same picture. The two women showed no signs of wanting to change their life plans, no dissatisfaction with work, no intentions to travel far, and certainly no history of running away. Gabe recounted his phone conversation with Marina. She was excited about her new outfit, about wanting to let off steam after a long week, with nothing out of the ordinary. Kelsey described Tessa as someone with a regular schedule, who never missed work without notice. If she planned to go anywhere, she would tell multiple people. Aaron provided more concrete evidence: an email from Marina the previous evening, confirming a client meeting early the following week. No one was planning to abandon anything. When this information was cross-checked with Jenna's account, Carson and Hale began piecing together part of the timeline. The two left the apartment in the late afternoon, drove Marina's car to Pensacola, arrived at the warehouse before the peak crowd, and then left together. No one saw them return to the car. No one confirmed they left with the man named Mason, but it was certain they had exited the warehouse while the party was still going on. The fact that all friends and family agreed the women had no intention of leaving town or disappearing further reinforced that this was not a voluntary departure. Carson noted carefully: no life plan changes, no personal stress, no arguments, no important belongings taken, no financial preparation for a long trip, and most essential items left in the apartment. All this virtually ruled out the possibility of leaving willingly. Hale inspected the apartment one last time and noted a valuable detail: no missing suitcases, no unusually large amount of clothes taken, toothbrushes and personal items all still there. Those small details, to an investigator, were worth far more than emotional denials. As they left the apartment, Carson glanced back at the parking lot below the stairs. Marina's sedan sat motionless, exactly where Jenna said, a thin layer of dust on the hood, showing it hadn't been used since the previous evening. This meant that if Marina and Tessa left the warehouse with someone, they definitely didn't use their own vehicle. And with the data just gathered, Carson understood they were facing a disappearance that couldn't be explained by any voluntary reason. With statements from friends and the roommate firmly establishing that Marina and Tessa had no intention of leaving, Carson and Hale immediately moved to the next step in the 2004 investigation process, analyzing the victims' communication devices, hoping to find even the smallest signal that could reveal what happened after they left the warehouse in Pensacola. But this was the moment the two investigators most acutely felt the technical wall every Florida police unit faced at the time. Phones in 2004 had no GPS, no real-time location pinging, no background data apps, no integrated maps, nothing to trace the owner's path beyond faint traces in call logs and texts. In the sheriff's office tech room, a technician pulled up the network connection reports for the two phone numbers. The data lines appeared dry and almost meaningless. Timestamps of texts sent, timestamps of ringing calls, a few messages sent before the two vanished, but absolutely no location information. All Carson could see was the last time the phones were powered on and connected to the provider's network, but that revealed nothing about where the women were or how they left the warehouse beyond Marina's car. At that time, any app-based tracking systems were not yet common, or even widely existent, making tracing missing persons almost entirely dependent on eyewitnesses and physical sightings. When Carson asked the technician to check the nearest cell tower the phones had connected to, the report left the team sighing. The coverage area of the tower near the warehouse was so large, it encompassed the entire industrial zone, the highway, part of South Pensacola residential areas, and even the road back to Fort Walton Beach. With a radius of thousands of meters, pinpointing exactly where the phones connected from was impossible. Unlike later systems where data could be analyzed for movement or signal strength, 2004 mobile networks only indicated the phone had connected in an area, not a coordinate. Carson tried asking if they could narrow it down based on the continuous signal loss timeline, but the technician shook his head. Both phones stopped operating shortly after leaving the warehouse area, and this could happen for many reasons: dead battery, powered off, placed in a no-signal zone, or intentionally turned off. There was no way to know for sure. Hale, accustomed to reconstructing routes from communication history, reviewed the call logs and noted Marina and Tessa made no further calls to anyone after leaving the warehouse, and no one could reach them afterward. The messages sent earlier showed they had no plans beyond attending the party and returning home. But the complete lack of response after that point made Carson even more certain they had left the warehouse under abnormal circumstances. While reviewing the logs, Hale noticed a short gap between the final messages and the phones losing connection, but even this detail couldn't help reconstruct the path. All possibilities remained open, but none led to a concrete conclusion. It was this very ambiguity that made phone analysis useless in the most frustrating way. There was data, but the data said nothing. Carson leaned against the metal table in the tech room, rubbing his forehead, clearly sensing the unease of a disappearance without a map or foundation. If the case had happened in the following decade, a few commands would have revealed travel routes, stops, GPS signals, even full path maps. But in 2004, all they had were overly broad tower ranges and simple lines noting message sent or unanswered call. When Carson tried checking if the carrier retained any additional data, like signal strength or tower handoff times, the answer was still no. Systems at that time didn't store such details, and even if they did, they were only kept briefly before automatic deletion. All tracing possibilities closed before they could begin. Hale wrote in the report that insufficient data to determine path after leaving warehouse, a cold but accurate conclusion reflecting the reality that the case lacked any clear direction. No cameras. No one saw how they left the warehouse. No personal vehicle missing. No indicative phone signals, and no GPS logs to cross-reference. The two victims left the warehouse and stepped into complete void. In every missing persons case, the phone is the last thing belonging to the victim that leaves a trace. But here, the two phones had essentially become inert objects, providing no useful information to police. Carson looked at the printed cell tower map one last time, a white sheet with a huge circle covering a vast area, then set it down with a heavy sigh. Without new data, returning to square one seemed inevitable, but at least they knew one thing for sure. The lack of location data meant the case couldn't rely on technology for guidance. They had to fall back on the most classic methods: witness statements, field observations, and any signs that might exist, however faint. And in that moment, Carson understood this disappearance was slipping from the usual trajectory, falling into a darkness where every approach was obscured by the technical limitations of 2004. When analyzing the communication devices yielded no viable leads, Carson and Hale were forced to move to the next step, organizing a field search along the route that Marina and Tessa most likely took to head home after the party. The road from Pensacola to Fort Walton Beach was a familiar journey for those living in the Panhandle area, a stretch that ran through sparse pine forests, bridges spanning the dark waters of bayous, then curving around scattered residential areas before merging onto Highway 98. This route didn't offer many alternatives, and logically, if the two girls left the warehouse to return to Fort Walton Beach, they almost certainly had to pass through here. Carson contacted the volunteer search unit and local patrol teams to plan a sweep starting the next morning. They began from the warehouse gate, where witnesses the previous night had seen the two heading toward the parking lot. There were no signs or traces left behind, just a dry lot with a few rotten wooden planks and patches of wild grass torn by the sea wind. Carson marked this point as the search starting location, but he knew this was almost the easiest part. If something had happened to Marina and Tessa after leaving the warehouse, the clues would be along the long journey ahead. The search team split into smaller groups, each responsible for a different section of the route: the area near the Pensacola industrial zone, the highway shoulders, the trails leading down to the river, and the less traveled side roads. Hale monitored the map, pointing to priority areas. Tight curves where accidents often occurred, sections with poor visibility obscured by tree lines, spots with rough pavement that could easily cause loss of vehicle control. If for any reason the two had run into trouble on the road, these would be the first places likely to show traces. But as the patrol teams scanned every meter of the road, the results shattered any initial hopes. Both shoulders were completely clean. No tire skid marks, no shattered glass, no bent guardrails, no oil stains, nothing that an accident or sudden incident would leave behind. Carson kept asking over the radio if the groups ahead had seen anything suspicious, and the responses echoed like a shadow: nothing. By midday, the search team shifted to the roadside forest areas, a fairly wide zone of low bushes, uneven ground from pine roots, and some sections eroded into deep gullies by rainwater. This was where, in many other missing persons cases, police might find a dropped item, a footprint, or even a scarf blown off a moving vehicle. But Florida's pine forests in summer were a tough adversary. Dry pine needles constantly falling to cover the ground, strong sea winds blowing through the canopies, so that anything on the surface for a few hours would be obscured, blown away, or buried. The K-9 unit was deployed, but after several sniffing rounds with no signs related to the two girls, Carson realized the chances of finding traces in this area were virtually zero. When moving to check the bridges spanning the calm northern bay waters, the search team lingered longer at spots with low railings or places where a vehicle could pull over close to the edge. Some experienced investigators suggested that sometimes victims might stop their car, or the vehicle could get stuck, leaving skid marks, side mirror fragments, or something similar. But the results were the same: no clues. The pavement was smooth as if no car had passed the night before, let alone been the site of an incident. All accident-related possibilities were gradually ruled out. Hale's group thoroughly checked every section of median strips, mile markers, bridge piers, and open lots under the bridges, places where a vehicle could plunge if it veered off course. But there were no tire tracks, no extended dirt ruts, no fuel smell, nothing indicating a vehicle had left the roadway. Even the muddy banks near the water's edge showed no tire imprints. Along the route to Fort Walton Beach, smaller groups walked the shoulders, picking up anything that might belong to the two girls: parking passes, wallets, handkerchiefs, phones, jewelry, but it was all just roadside trash, unrelated to Marina or Tessa. A few passers-by stopped to ask what was going on upon seeing the heavy police presence, but no one remembered seeing the two girls or an unusual vehicle that night. Carson increasingly sensed the unusual nature of this disappearance. If they left the warehouse together, they had to show up somewhere along this route. But the road was completely clean, undisturbed, with no incident having occurred. In other missing persons cases, no matter how few traces there was always something, a dropped item, a paint scrape, a skid mark. Here, it was utterly empty. As the sun tilted westward, the search team concluded the first sweep. Carson looked down at the notepad in his hand, where not a single line contained useful results. A route dozens of miles long had been thoroughly checked, and all they had was the absolute absence of traces. Marina and Tessa left the warehouse, but it seemed they never traveled the route that anyone leaving Pensacola for Fort Walton Beach would inevitably use. It was this very emptiness that made Carson feel like they were standing before an impenetrable door. Every lid led back to the same dark point, a void that ordinary logic couldn't explain. The complete sweep of the entire route from Pensacola to Fort Walton Beach, yielding no results, forced Carson and Hale to shift to expanding the search scope, targeting areas where a vehicle or two people could leave the main road unnoticed, that being Blackwater Forest and the strips along Highway 98, where the complex terrain, dense tree cover, and numerous low-lying areas could conceal traces for days, even weeks. Blackwater Forest was one of the largest forests in the Panhandle, known for its tall pine stands, tangled low grass, and trail systems running deep inside. For a search, this was an area where traces could easily be obscured and hard to detect even for experienced teams. Carson knew this well, but they had no other choice. If Marina and Tessa didn't follow the main route, or if something happened that led them into this forest area, then K-9 units and IR helicopters would be the only tools that could offer hope of finding clues. Early the next morning, with mist still shrouding the treetops, the search team deployed K-9 units into the Blackwater Forest edges, starting from the side roads connecting to Highway 98. The working dogs sniffed every strip of land, every bush, every damp area under the pine canopy, but there were no reactions indicating they picked up any live human scent or anything related to the victims. In recent missing persons searches, K-9s often reacted clearly when detecting human passage through an area, but this time, Carson only saw head shakes from the handlers, signaling helplessness in finding nothing. Even more concerning, Blackwater Forest had many overlapping natural scents: pine resin, animals, mud, decaying leaves, all making it extremely difficult to isolate any specific human scent. As the sun rose higher, IR helicopters were dispatched to fly over the forest and the Highway 98 strips. From above, infrared cameras scanned every patch of forest, every clearing, every roadside section that might hide human or vehicle traces. But the imagery showed only mixed heat signatures from vegetation, wildlife, and ground retaining solar warmth. No heat signals matching human body size or vehicle engines were recorded in the scan area. A few scattered hotspots were checked closely, but all turned out to be animals or ground heat reflections. Carson monitored the feed from the screen in the command vehicle, his eyes constantly scanning the color regions on the thermal map, but it was all just meaningless bright spots. He knew that if a vehicle was under dense canopy, IR could detect abnormal temperature changes, but with Blackwater's thick foliage, the detection probability dropped very low. And the worst part, if anyone deliberately hit a vehicle or something in this forest, just pushing it a few meters deeper could completely conceal it under the canopy and dry leaf layer. By mid-morning, the search team expanded to smaller dirt paths leading deeper into the forest, areas sometimes used by hunters, fishermen, or local off-road groups. But as Carson and Hale walked these trails, what they saw were only old footprints, water bottles left from weeks ago, long extinguished campfire scars. Nothing related to Marina or Tessa, no purse traces, no items that could have fallen during movement, no fabric scraps, no tire marks leaving the road, no spots suggesting the two girls had ever set foot here. Each team reported the same situation: soft soil, but no fresh tire tracks, low grass flattened from weeks earlier, but without specific direction, pine forest so dense that light barely reached the ground, making even spotting disturbances difficult. Hale reminded Carson that areas like Blackwater could hide traces in just one night, wind blowing pine needles down, light rain creating new mud layers, animals moving around, breaking any human marks. This made the search slow, exhausting, and almost unlikely to yield immediate results. When the group shifted to sweeping the strips along Highway 98, sections with deep parallel ditches running alongside the road, hope flickered briefly, as these were places a vehicle could slide into during an incident, or if forced off the road. But after thorough checks of every section, from shallow to deep ditches, the result was still zero. No glass shards, no metal, no broken plastic, no skid marks, even the soil on ditch sides intact as if untouched. By early afternoon, with the sun beating straight down on the scorching pavement, Carson and Hale stood by the command vehicle, looking at the map marked with countless trails the teams had just covered. No useful information emerged from Blackwater Forest or the Highway 98 strips. Every area they checked returned absolute silence, an emptiness hard to interpret. Something didn't add up in this picture. If Marina and Tessa left the warehouse in a vehicle, that vehicle had to pass through one of these areas, but the search team found no evidence to prove it. No tire tracks, no debris, no canine reactions, no abnormal heat signals. Carson felt like the entire disappearance was slipping beyond reason's grasp. Blackwater Forest was vast. Highway 98 stretched dozens of miles, but no matter how large, there should still be traces if the two girls passed through. Yet reality denied it. As they concluded the second search wave, a heavy feeling enveloped not just Carson and Hale, but the entire team. They had scoured the exact places where clues should have been. But what they got back was only the cold silence of the terrain. Blackwater Forest and the Highway 98 strips revealed nothing, or worse, they concealed everything too well. With no other options left, Carson and Hale returned to one of the scantest but most specific pieces of information they had from the warehouse. Witness statements that Marina and Tessa might have left the party with a strange man and a silver car. Though this description was vague and lacking details, it was still the only lead related to a vehicle. Witnesses described the sedan appearing in the back warehouse parking lot, where dim yellow lighting made colors hard to distinguish, but most agreed the vehicle was a sedan with a silver or light gray hue. Carson immediately requested the administrative department to pull records of silver sedans registered in Escambia and Okaloosa counties over the past 6 months. A list so long it was daunting just printing it out. After 2 hours filtering data based on basic criteria, like production year, registration address, and travel distance to the warehouse, they narrowed it to 23 silver sedans in the suspect range. That was still a large number, but at least manageable in a few days. In the parking lot behind the sheriff's office, Carson divided the list among other investigator groups, each handling a few owners, tasked with checking vehicle exteriors for scratches, unusual paint chips, or any signs the car had been involved in travel related to the disappearance. Hale's group handled vehicles near Pensacola first, starting with residential areas just blocks from the warehouse. They knocked on doors, asking owners if they had used the vehicle the night of the party. Most owners had clear alibis. One was working a night shift at a factory, car parked in the lot. Another was traveling out of state. One sedan was in a garage with a broken engine, immobile. Carson worked the Fort Walton beach edge, where 3 silver sedans fell within the radius of the route Marina and Tessa might have taken. One owner was elderly, rarely leaving home at night. His silver sedan was thick with dust, tires flat, no fresh scratches. Another belonged to a new mother, not attending any events for months. Her home's basic black and white security camera footage showed the car unmoved in the garage on the incident date. The third belonged to a delivery worker, but his schedule placed him in Tallahassee when the girls vanished. None showed signs of plate changes, repainting, or attempts to hide anything. The suspect vehicles were thoroughly inspected. Carson crouched to check undercarriages, flashlight on wheel wells, gloved hand sweeping fender liners for stuck dirt or twigs, details often present when a vehicle leaves pavement for forest or swampy areas. But all were clean. In quick notebook reports, Carson just wrote a short line, no signs of vehicle involvement. When the full list of 23 silver sedans was checked, The search team found no anomalies. None had routes matching the time Marina and Tessa vanished, none showed signs of carrying extra passengers, and none had scratches or mud fitting the warehouse site or forest routes. This made the witness information even harder to trust. Maybe the strange man wasn't in a silver sedan. Maybe witnesses mistook the color in poor lighting. Or perhaps the involved vehicle wasn't locally registered, or was rented, or out-of-state plates, possibilities expanding the suspect list to unmanageable levels for now. Carson reviewed the entire checking process and felt like a repeating loop. They had a fragile lead, clung to it, expanded into a checklist, but results were just a crossed-off list with no one left to pursue. On his desk, the silver sedan file thickened with pages of notes, but all concluding the same: no matching vehicles. Narrowing down suspect vehicles, one of the most viable investigation directions, was now closed without leaving a crack. Marina and Tessa might have left the warehouse in a silver sedan, or might not. Witnesses might remember correctly or wrongly, but what was certain, no vehicle on the list was connected to the missing girls. And with this investigation path fizzling out, Carson and Hale had to face the uncomfortable reality that the case was losing what little they had, like branches of a rotting tree snapping off before leading to any useful conclusion. After the search of 23 silver sedans yielded absolutely no clues whatsoever, Carson and Hale returned to the only remaining lead, originating from the warehouse, the man who called himself Robert Mason. This was the only name connected to both victims in the final hours they were seen in public, but its vagueness made it impossible for Carson to ignore, even though the likelihood that it was a fake name was very high. Nevertheless, in a disappearance case with no physical traces, every scrap of information, no matter how small, had to be verified to the very end. Therefore, they decided to spend the entire afternoon conducting a thorough investigation into this name, starting with the legal databases that the sheriff's office had access to. In the central computer room, they began by searching the Florida DMV system. If Mason was a local resident, his driver's license or vehicle registration would appear within seconds, but when the technician entered the name, the result came back empty. They tried alternate spellings, Mason, Masson, Masson, but all were futile. There was no man named Robert Mason in the age range described by witnesses, living near Pensacola, Fort Walton Beach, or any area in the 3 surrounding counties. Carson requested expanding the search to Florida's business registration database, since Mason might have used a real business card, but not his real name. After a few minutes of retrieval, the system listed a series of other Masons, but they were all a plumber in Miami, an accountant in Tampa, or a furniture store manager in Gainesville, none matching the description or having appeared in the area recently. To be thorough, Hale checked the residency systems as well, including voter registration and tax data. Once again, nothing. Every name entry returned no match found. A sense of unease began to spread through Carson. The name Mason was starting to feel more like a shadow than a real person, but he pressed on. They moved to the NCIC, the federal database that stores records of offenders, wanted individuals, and arrest histories. If Mason had a prior record, or had ever used false identities, this system might reveal some connection. But after filtering the data for nearly 10 minutes, Carson frowned as the screen remained unchanged. There was no Robert Mason matching the age, height, or area of activity described by the warehouse witnesses. Hale suggested reviewing the witness statements again, hoping to uncover an additional detail that could help identify the man. But as they went through each page of notes, no license plate description, no one saw his eye color, no one was certain about his hair color, no one had any basis to recognize him beyond the name he himself had given. Many weren't even sure if he had told the truth, or just blurted it out while trying to impress. The vagueness of the name Robert Mason was so evident that it was as if he had simply glided through that night like an indistinct shadow. Carson tried a riskier step, searching the temporary residency records of apartments around the warehouse. Sometimes, party attendees came from short-term rentals or motels, but the records only showed lists of legal residents, none matching any description. Hotel data within a 10-mile radius was checked, but no one named Mason had registered a room in the 3 days before or after the event. No hotel staff remembered a guest fitting the description. From being the only lead, Mason had now become an empty name, with no face, no address, no verifiable data whatsoever. If the witnesses hadn't been mistaken, then this man had deliberately used a completely non-existent identity. Carson realized that this not only complicated the case, but also opened up a frightening possibility. Anyone wanting to conceal their identity in a chaotic environment like the warehouse would know how to choose a common name, ordinary enough not to raise suspicion, but generic enough that tracing it would yield nothing. A name like Robert Mason was perfect for that purpose. Hale wondered if he might be from out of state, but they had already tried reverse searches through federal systems. If he had ever registered a driver's license in any state, there would be a trace. But nearly an hour of national data scanning still led to no man matching the witness's description. That brought Carson to a clear conclusion: the name Robert Mason was fake. Not a system error, not missing data, but fake from the moment it was spoken at the warehouse. And if a name was used to approach two girls, but didn't exist in any system, that made the man's intentions all the more suspicious. As Carson closed his laptop, the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. This was the moment he distinctly felt the case beginning to slip beyond the bounds of the familiar. They hadn't found the car, hadn't found traces, hadn't seen Marina or Tessa on any routes, and now the last man to speak with both girls had vanished from every database as if he had never existed. From a faint lead, the name Robert Mason had cooled into a cold void. Just like every investigative direction they had pursued over the past days, all leading to the same end: nothing. After the name Robert Mason was confirmed to be completely fake and left no trace in any system, Carson and Hale were forced to return to a more traditional investigative direction. Screening individuals who had direct connections to Marina and Tessa, those in their close circle who might have motive, conflict, or any link that could explain the girls' disappearance. Although all initial signs indicated neither had personal issues before vanishing, procedures still required completely ruling out involvement from those closest to them. They started with Marina's ex-boyfriend Andrew, whom she had broken up with about 4 months prior. Andrew lived in Destin, just a short drive from Fort Walton Beach, and was known to be introverted and rarely partied. When Carson and Hale went to see him, Andrew seemed genuinely confused by the news of Marina's disappearance, but he cooperated fully, providing his work schedule, messages, and shift logs from the Marine Services Company where he worked. Records showed he had been on the night shift throughout the entire time of the party, with at least 3 coworkers confirming it. On Carson's desk, Andrew's information was almost immediately ruled out: no motive, no opportunity, no contact near the time of the incident. Next was Tessa's closest coworker, a girl named Linda, who worked at the same coffee shop where Tessa served part-time. Linda insisted Tessa had been completely normal in the days leading up: no arguments, no money disputes, no suspicious encounters. Work records also showed Tessa had no unusual absences, no debts, and no signs of stress. Linda provided Carson with their most recent messages, content revolving around work, shifts, and casual jokes. Nothing in the messages suggested Tessa was in trouble with anyone at work. Carson noted in the report, no signs of personal conflict. Moving to the neighbors on the same floor as Marina and Tessa, the results were similar. An older woman living next door said the 2 girls were very friendly and polite, often greeting her in the hallway. No arguments heard, no strangers coming in or out of the apartment in the week prior, no unusual activity the night they went to the party. Other neighbors confirmed no strange noises, no sighting of the girls returning late that night, further reinforcing that Marina and Tessa had disappeared before having a chance to return home. Carson continued expanding the list, screening male friends, female friends, former coworkers, casual acquaintances, all interviewed. Some knew Marina, but not Tessa, or vice versa, and were asked to provide details about recent encounters. Every statement followed a similar pattern: both girls lived normal lives, stayed out of trouble, didn't know anyone suspicious, and weren't being followed or threatened. When Hale reviewed the contact lists from Marina's and Tessa's phones, he found no calls from unknown numbers in the days prior, nor any messages suggesting they were in trouble. Those who had spoken with them before the disappearance, friends, co-workers, dates, were all verified with clear alibis, and none had any connection to the warehouse or Pensacola that night. Carson pinned the files to the analysis board in the meeting room, a whiteboard with connections marked by red pins. Each name crossed off after verification. One by one, they were clear. A co-worker of Marina, who had a minor disagreement months earlier, was investigated, but it turned out to be a misunderstanding long resolved. A male friend who had liked Tessa was scrutinized more closely, but his work schedule and evidence placing him in Mobile, Alabama, at the time completely ruled him out. By the end of the day, the list of close associates was nearly wiped clean. No one in the girls' personal lives had a motive to harm them. No one was at the warehouse. No one exhibited suspicious behavior beforehand. No one intersected with the name Robert Mason. Carson stared at the increasingly empty board and felt the weight of eliminating so many without gaining any new leads. A typical missing persons case often had a circle of close suspects, ex-lovers, new acquaintances, contentious neighbors, disgruntled coworkers, but here, that circle was completely empty. Everyone questioned cooperated, had alibis, and had no reason to harm Marina or Tessa. As Carson and Hale wrapped up the day, both entered the same conclusion in the investigative report. No motive or connection found from close associates. And that very note made Carson realize something troubling. If acquaintances weren't involved, if no local vehicle matched, if the only name was fake, then the person who approached the girls that night was almost certainly from outside their circle, a dark figure who appeared and vanished in the night, leaving nothing but a non-existent name. The deadlock in verifying acquaintances and ruling out all close contacts forced Carson and Hale to expand the search once more, this time toward an area even more complex than the Blackwater Forest, the network of small lakes and scattered swamps throughout Santa Rosa County. Within a radius not too far from the warehouse, the area featured dozens of natural lakes and man-made ponds, along with deep swamp strips capable of concealing a vehicle or large object if it veered off the main road in an unusual way. In fact, in many panhandle disappearance cases, submerged vehicles had been the reason victims weren't found for weeks. Carson knew the likelihood was low, but they couldn't ignore it. The next morning, while the sun still hadn't pierced the thin fog over the roadside trees, the Santa Rosa County dive team was already at the first lake on the list. It was a small lake with dark shore water, its surface so calm it reflected the overhead canopy. The dive team brought portable sonar, the kind that could detect large objects beneath depths invisible to the naked eye. They started by towing the sonar along the nearshore areas, gradually widening the search circle. Carson stood on the shore, monitoring the sonar screen via the team's mobile device, intently watching every shadow on the dark green background. But most signals were just submerged rocks or rotting tree trunks. No sign of a car, large metal debris, or anything potentially related to the disappearance. When the divers went underwater, they scanned every mud patch and dark area on the bottom, but the results remained disappointing. Murky water, deep mud, thick layers of decayed leaves, making visibility difficult. But no matter the challenge, there was still no trace of a submerged vehicle or related items. The second lake, about 4 miles away, was larger, deeper, and had a more uneven bottom than the first. The dive team followed the same procedure: sonar first, diving second. Carson and Hale split up to observe from opposite shores, noting areas where sonar returned suspicious shapes. However, like the first lake, those signals were clusters of roots or sunken boulders. While the dive team waited for sonar signals to stabilize, Hale checked the shoreline for possible tire tracks or drag marks leading into the water, but the ground around the lake remained undisturbed. No impressions, no fresh dirt trails, no sign a vehicle had entered. The remaining lakes on the list, spread across the swampy terrain of Santa Rosa County, making the work even more grueling. Swamps weren't just still water. They included areas of deep sinking mud, dense reed patches, and narrow access points only small trucks or off-road vehicles could reach. Still, could the mysterious man have had reason to bring the girls to such a place? Carson ruled out nothing, because this disappearance had defied normal logic from start to finish. The first swamp they checked was less than a mile from the main road. The dive team used probing poles to identify surveyable areas, but within minutes, they reported unstable depth, excessively thick mud, and tangled roots, making it impossible to deploy heavy equipment. Carson noted it, but still requested a shoreline sweep for physical traces. Once again, nothing, no tire tracks, no clothing, no dropped items, no purses, no papers. The second and third swamps were even harder to access. Dirt paths leading in were overgrown, showing the areas had seen little human activity for months. As the team neared the water's edge, the ground was so soft that every step sank deeply, meaning any potential traces from the night of the disappearance would have long been erased. The sonar team tried scanning a large pond amid the reeds, but signals were weak, reflections unclear, and nearly impossible to distinguish objects beneath the thick mud layer. When divers attempted descent, they quickly surfaced and confirmed this wasn't an environment that could be effectively searched. What disappointed Carson most was that all these areas shared a common trait. If a vehicle had gone in, at any depth, sonar could still detect the shape of a large metal mass. The complete absence of such readings was clear confirmation that no car had sunk in the lakes or swamps they had just checked. From the ground, Hale walked natural trails around the area, hoping for old tire marks or something dropped from a pocket, but everything was empty. Wind, rain, animals, time, all had contributed to erasing traces, and Carson knew that, but even with traces gone, a submerged vehicle couldn't be completely hidden. Yet here, there was nothing, no tires, no broken mirrors, no metal, no belongings. By the end of the day, as the sun sank behind the distant tree line, Carson stood at the swamp's edge, silently watching the sonar team pack up equipment with a heavy gaze. Another investigative direction closed in absolute silence. The small lakes and swamps of Santa Rosa County, vast and deep as they were, held no answers to the disappearance of Marina and Tessa. As Carson and Hale drove back to headquarters, they carried with them the heavy feeling of a truth that was becoming increasingly clear. All three major search sweeps, the route from Pensacola to Fort Walton Beach, the Blackwater Forest, and the stretch along Highway 98, along with the system of small lakes and swamps in Santa Rosa County, had all ended in absolute emptiness. There were no vehicle traces, no metal fragments, no items left behind, no tire tracks, no scratched paint, no signs whatsoever that Marina and Tessa had ever been in those areas. When Carson compiled all the reports at the end of the day, the pages were almost entirely filled with identical conclusions: nothing discovered, no leads. The most frustrating part of this investigation was that all the reliable tools of the modern era simply did not exist in 2004. The warehouse had no security cameras, a normal thing for makeshift venues converted for parties. The dozens of miles of road between Pensacola and Fort Walton Beach had no traffic cameras or private ones close enough to capture clear images. Surveillance technology back then was not advanced. Phones had no GPS for location tracking. Even cell towers could not provide positioning data more accurate than a few miles. That left the entire journey of Marina and Tessa, after leaving the warehouse, like sinking into a blind spot, a void that no logic could fill. Carson sat in front of the data board, facing the blank spaces. No cameras meant they could not review footage of the two girls leaving the warehouse. No GPS meant they could not know which route they took. No physical evidence meant they could not reconstruct any physical event. No real-time data meant they could not recreate the movements of the two phones. And there were no witnesses who saw them after that hazy moment in the warehouse backyard. It all combined into a long chain of knots, covering the entire case like a thick curtain. Hale walked into the small meeting room, where Carson was reviewing each report again. He placed the sonar team's notes on the table and shook his head. a gesture that needed no explanation. Carson already knew the content: no submerged objects, no car at the bottom of the lakes. Nothing related to the disappearance. They could not say that Marina and Tessa had an accident, because there were no traces to suggest it. They also could not say the two had left voluntarily, because all statements from friends and family ruled out that possibility. There was no evidence they had been attacked, because there was no crime scene, no physical evidence, no witnesses who saw them in danger. The case was in a strange position between all those possibilities. Nothing confirmed a specific scenario. Even the silver sedan, the only lead from a witness when checked, turned out to be another dead end. Carson crossed off the list of 23 silver sedans from the investigation board, leaving a blank space where he had hoped to find at least a small connection. But all he had now was the biggest missing piece on the board. Vehicle unidentified. Hale, standing next to the board, lightly touched the red pins connecting the scattered pieces of information. None led to another. Every arrow ended in a dead end. When the two investigators went back over the entire sequence of events, they had to admit that the disappearance had one particularly baffling feature. The two girls left the warehouse in a matter of minutes, and from that moment on, there was no further trace of their existence. It was as if someone had erased every mark in just a few hours. In many missing persons cases, Carson had encountered difficult ones, but there was always at least one point to hold on to: an item, a call, a camera that accidentally captured an image, a passerby witness. Here, the entire space after the warehouse was like complete darkness, and that left Carson both confused and uneasy. When summarizing the 3 major search sweeps, Carson wrote in the report, "Search teams have covered all plausible routes, roadside forests, swamps, small lakes, but no leads discovered, no cameras, no GPS, no signs of abandoned property or vehicle, no real-time data. The case currently lacks any trace point whatsoever." That was not just a conclusion. It was a definitive confirmation that the investigation was heading straight into a dead end. Heading into the final months of 2004, Carson and Hale carried a feeling no investigator wants to face. Stagnation had begun to tighten its grip on the case. Any subsequent reports, if there were any, would only repeat the previous conclusions: no additional witnesses, no new physical evidence, no cameras discovered, and absolutely no one who had seen Marina or Tessa since they left the warehouse on the night they vanished. Dispatch occasionally received vague calls from the public saying they thought they had seen the two girls somewhere, but when Carson checked, they were all mistaken identities or guesses with no investigative value. The following weeks passed quietly with fading hope, and the disappearance began to slip down the priority list as other cases with clearer evidence kept emerging. When Carson reviewed the entire file one last time, not just to look for leads, but to determine if they had missed any detail so small it was invisible, he had to admit that every step had been checked. Friends, acquaintances, main routes, forests, swamps, lakes, suspect vehicles, false identities, all exhausted without finding answers. The case was standing still, as if suspended in midair, neither falling nor moving forward. One December afternoon, during an internal meeting in the small conference room at the sheriff's office, unit leaders officially discussed transferring the file to the cold case group. Carson, though he understood it was necessary, still found it hard to accept. But he also knew they could not keep pouring resources into a case with no viable directions left, while new incidents kept waiting for attention. The file bearing the names Marina Lopez and Tessa Caldwell was sealed with a new label, "Inactive Cold Case," and moved to the storage cabinets of the cold case unit in Tallahassee, where cases covered in the dust of time awaited some future chance of revival. As Carson placed the file into the storage box, a sense of helplessness spread through his entire body. Not because he did not want to keep searching, but because he knew that everything an investigator could do under conditions of limited technology, lacking evidence, and lacking witnesses, had already been done. With the official transfer to cold case status, the disappearance of Marina and Tessa entered a phase of silence, a prolonged silence shrouded in the void of things never known from that year. After the file on Marina Lopez and Tessa Caldwell was moved to cold case, the following years passed in the characteristic silence of unsolved disappearances, and the period from 2005-2010 only added more dust to this already thin file. By regulation, the cold case unit still had to conduct periodic reviews, occasionally reopening the file to see if any new leads had emerged. But in reality, most of those reviews were just rereading old notes, remarking old leads, and once again confirming that nothing could be expanded into a new investigative direction. In 2005, a young investigator newly assigned to Tallahassee was tasked with reviewing unresolved cases, and Marina, Tessa was on that list. He read every page carefully, from the notes on the warehouse, route maps, cell tower printouts, to the explanations about the 23 silver sedans, but the more he read, the clearer the deadlock left by his predecessors became. No physical evidence, no new witnesses, no overlooked or missed proof. He noted in the internal report that insufficient data to reactivate investigation, and the file returned to its place. In 2006, a comprehensive review of all disappearances in the Panhandle was conducted after another major case was uncovered, but when the list was filtered, the Marina, Tessa case still had no similarities with area incidents to link or expand the investigation. No pattern crime alerts, no reports of women approached by a man claiming to be Mason, no reports of suspicious vehicles leaving the warehouse at that time. Everything stood still as if the night the two girls vanished was an untouchable void. From 2007 to 2008, the cold case unit gained a few new investigators, each required to review a series of backlog cases, including the file on Marina and Tessa. However, in every meeting where they presented this file again, the conclusion remained the same. No new leads, no new data, no new witnesses. One investigator tried contacting the families again to see if they remembered any undisclosed details or if anyone had made suspicious contact, but the answers were only heavy shakes of the head. No one saw the two after the warehouse, no one heard anything strange, no anonymous letters or ransom demands, no signs the two were still alive. In 2009, the cold case unit received notification from CODIS about expanding the statewide DNA database and a request to review some long-term disappearances for possible matches. But the Marina, Tessa file was categorized as unmatchable because there were no bodies, no evidence containing DNA, no samples to compare. Carson, though no longer in charge of the case by then, still recalled the feeling of helplessness upon learning that technological advances were happening but could not be applied to the case of the two girls he had once poured his effort into searching for. Throughout those years, what pushed the file deeper into darkness was the absence of any new tips or additional statements. No one came forward claiming to have seen the two, no information from neighboring states, no contacts suggesting they were alive or had been harmed. All community contacts were speculation or misidentifications, and when checked, they were ruled out. Even the name Robert Mason, once the only piece of a lead, did not reappear in any incidents or reports throughout that half-decade. Each review was like turning the same broken lock again. No doors opened, no hints revealed anything more. By the end of 2010, when a young investigator placed the file on the desk and looked at the pages creased with time, he understood that the Marina and Tessa case had become one of the unit's most difficult files, not because of too many overlapping details, but because there was absolutely nothing to grasp. And that very emptiness continued to push the two girls into the pitch-black region of unsolved disappearances, where all hope was worn away with each passing year. From 2011 to 2014, the rapid development of forensic technology across the United States, particularly the expansion of the National CODIS DNA database and advances in microevidence analysis, sparked new hope for hundreds of long-term missing persons files, but for the Marina Lopez and Tessa Caldwell case, that hope quickly faded, for one insurmountable reason. They had no bodies, no evidence, no DNA, nothing to compare. Once a year, the cold case unit would include old cases in evaluation reports to see if any qualified for reanalysis with new technology. And each time the Marina, Tessa file appeared, investigators had to cross their names off the list after just a few minutes of review. CODIS expansion meant millions of new DNA samples added to the system, from convicted individuals, arrestees, to unidentified samples collected from crime scenes. But without a DNA sample from the actual scene of the Marina and Tessa disappearance, that expansion could provide no answers. The cold case unit tried reviewing the file in other ways, checking if any indirect evidence had been overlooked, such as remaining clothing, personal items of the victims, or traces collected from homes or personal belongings. But the original file was too thin, and Carson, when handling the case, had collected everything possible, and the reality was there was no forensic evidence because there was no scene to collect from. The two phones were no longer active and stored nothing beyond message and call logs that had long been worthless. No hair samples, no fiber samples, no fingernail clippings, no biological traces, nothing to send for testing. Even emerging cell phone signal data analysis technologies were useless because the 2004 cell tower data had been deleted years earlier under retention policies. All the advances the cold case unit had hoped for became cruel reminders that the Marina, Tessa case not only lacked leads, it lacked the basic structure of a case to apply forensic technology nearly a decade later. No evidence, no scene, no bodies. In 2012, a veteran investigator suggested reviewing all unidentified body discoveries in the Panhandle over the past 8 years, hoping that if bodies were not identified at the time of discovery, new technology could help. But when the list was filtered, no cases matched the two missing girls in terms of age, gender, physical characteristics, or decomposition timeline. Some bodies were found in accident situations, some related to domestic violence, a few with unknown causes of death, but none fell into the time frame right after Marina and Tessa vanished. Each file review led to the same statement in the minutes: no suspect bodies related. In 2013, when microtrace analysis technology was upgraded, a team of investigators tried seeing if items left in the two girls' apartment could contain traces of anyone besides them, but those items never left their possession on the night of the disappearance. Testing them only repeated the result that the apartment showed no intrusion by strangers. Hale, by then transferred to another unit, heard about an effort to reanalyze the case and requested to review the file. But even he, who knew every detail, could not find any point to expand into a new direction. "We have nothing to test," he wrote in an internal note. A short sentence, but an accurate description of this disappearance. In 2014, the cold case unit received funding for a project to reevaluate unsolved cases over 10 years old, and once again Marina, Tessa, was on the preliminary list, only to be removed from the final list due to lack of bodies and lack of evidence. Other cases with unsolved DNA, fiber samples, hair, blood traces, or even faint scenes could be submitted for forensic analysis. Marina and Tessa had nothing but scattered witness statements from the warehouse and a fabricated name. When the 2014 year-end report was submitted, the note on the Marina, Tessa case had only one line: "Unable to apply new forensic technology, file has no samples." And that was the most painful truth. Although forensic technology nationwide was entering a breakthrough phase, this disappearance remained stuck in place as on day one. Frozen, no progress, no technical hope. The leaps of science could not revive what had never been found. In early 2015, when most of the files in the cold case unit were still gathering dust on time-worn metal shelves, nature unexpectedly created a major upheaval that no investigator could have foreseen. A powerful storm moving through the Florida Panhandle, sweeping across Santa Rosa County, with winds that caused severe flooding in many areas, then quickly receding and leaving behind unusually low water levels in the lakes and ponds around Ward Basin. For nearly a decade, The water level there had remained stable due to rainfall and underground flow, but after the storm, it dropped nearly 1.5 meters below normal, exposing patches of mud that hadn't been seen in years. Residents around Ward Basin all noticed this change, but no one thought it was connected to any case until a middle-aged man named Mark Ridley, a fisherman who had frequented these waters regularly for 2 decades, spotted something strange emerging right in the middle of the dark mudflat south of the lake. That morning, Ridley brought his fishing rod, tackle box, and small wooden boat as usual. As he pushed the boat out about a few dozen meters, he realized the water was much shallower. The paddle even touched the bottom in places that had previously been deeper than a person's height. He was about to change direction toward deeper water when something about 30 meters away suddenly caught the sunlight, a curved piece of metal, just barely protruding above the mud and low reeds. At first, Ridley thought it was just an old boat hull fragment or a metal barrel discarded years ago. But as his small boat drifted closer, the object revealed more, a smooth curve, and the familiar rounded edge that anyone who has seen a car roof would recognize immediately. Ridley stood still for a few seconds. He had seen plenty of strange things in the water: tires, oil drums, wood scraps, old fishing line, but never the roof of a car in this area. What chilled him even more was its location. The car was completely submerged under deep mud, concealed by vegetation for years, and only now glinting as the water level dropped after the storm. Ridley immediately jammed the paddle into the mud, pulling the boat closer for a better look. When he touched the paddle tip to the metal, the mud crumbled away, revealing faded silver paint underneath. Something in him instantly triggered unease. A car submerged in these waters couldn't be normal. He tried pushing the paddle deeper to gauge the object's size, and when it hit the edge, he clearly felt a steel frame, wide, thick, and definitely from a sedan, not a boat or floating debris. Without hesitating another second, Ridley reached for the phone in his jacket pocket, his hand trembling slightly from an indescribable sense of dread. He dialed the Santa Rosa County Sheriff's Office while keeping his eyes fixed on the car roof gradually emerging amid the reeds. In that moment, he had only one thought: if this was some missing car, then someone might have been waiting nearly 10 years to be found. The dispatcher received the call at 9:23 a.m. Ridley's voice urgent but clear. "I think I just found a submerged car in Ward Basin Lake. Part of the roof is sticking up. It doesn't look like anything normal." The dispatcher asked him to describe the exact location. Ridley looked around, identifying landmarks from the boat ramp and the old wooden bridge, then detailed each point. Just minutes later, he was instructed to stay in place, not touch the object, and avoid getting closer to prevent disturbing the scene. Ridley nodded even though they couldn't see him. He pulled the boat to a safer spot, about 20 meters from the object, close enough to observe, but without impacting it. A light breeze blew across the lake, making the reeds sway around the protruding roof. The sight sent a shiver down Ridley's spine. The car might have been down there for a very long time, and he sensed that what lay beneath wasn't just steel and mud. Less than 15 minutes later, the sheriff's office dispatched a water patrol unit to the scene. 2 large police boats appeared from the north end of the lake and approached Ridley. When they arrived, he pointed toward the object. A deputy sheriff leaned down, using binoculars to get a clear view of the car roof. With just one glance, he confirmed it wasn't debris. "That's a vehicle. We need to secure the area immediately," he said. Soon after, the Ward Basin area was marked with warning buoys, requiring civilian boats to stay away. Another boat carrying sonar equipment was called in to scan the entire submerged object. On the sonar screen, the curve of the car roof quickly appeared, followed by the full outline of the body lying on its side, buried deep in mud but still retaining its shape. As the deputy looked at the outlines on the screen, he recognized a chilling coincidence: a sedan submerged in Ward Basin Lake. While nearly 10 years earlier, 2 young women and their car had vanished without a trace in the same general area. Ridley just stood silently, watching the scene unfold as more units arrived. Divers, forensics team, and scene commander. He had no idea that his simple call stemming from an ordinary fishing trip, was reopening a case that the entire panhandle had nearly forgotten. But as he looked at the dull gray car roof protruding from the mud, he clearly felt one thing: whatever was lying under the water would drag along stories that the entire community was never mentally prepared to hear. By early afternoon, the area around Ward Basin was completely sealed off, with warning buoys forming a semicircle around the submerged car's location. There was no doubt anymore. This was a sedan, and the roof protruding above the mud was just the first sign of a scene buried by time for over a decade. The dive team prepared to enter the water while Carson, who had been called from Tallahassee as soon as cross-referencing indicated a possible link to a 2004 cold case, was en route to the scene. For him, this morning's call was like a strong gust blowing open a door that had been firmly shut for years, a door he himself had once thought would never reopen. When Carson arrived, the sky had cleared after the storm, with thin gray clouds lingering and reflecting on the murky water. He stepped onto the wooden dock where the deputy was directing the recovery. As soon as he saw the tarnished silver roof protruding, Carson felt his heart skip a beat. That paint color, that shape, even faded, still matched the 2004 witness descriptions. A silver sedan. The one they had searched for weeks before falling into despair. Now, it lay right in front of him, just a few dozen meters from the shore. The divers went in first. The mud was so thick that each step forward created small ripples on the surface. When they reached the car roof, their hands sank deep into the cold mud. They had to use gloves to clear away chunks clinging like softened cement. Gradually, they located the rear window position and the glass. No longer intact, just corroded metal frames. One diver signaled to the recovery team. The car was tilted at 30 degrees, almost fully buried, with only the roof exposed due to the receding water. That meant the cable hookup would have to be extremely careful. Otherwise, the body could break or mud could pour back in, destroying any remaining evidence. A crane from the hydraulic rescue unit was brought in, positioned on reinforced plywood to prevent sinking. Steel cables were lowered, piercing through the reeds and into the water. Two divers worked under the mud layer, trying to find attachment points on the chassis without shifting the car. They had to feel around corroded metal sections, sensing where the load-bearing frame was versus weakened body panels. Finally, after nearly 40 minutes immersed in thick mud and cold water, the dive team signaled readiness. The crane began tensioning the cables. The water around the car churned, creating expanding circles. The mud surface trembled like a giant creature being yanked from its long slumber. Then slowly, the roof rose higher. Mud, algae, and weeds trailed in heavy streams. A faint metal screech mixed with the water sounds. The body emerged, coated in black mud, the once shiny silver paint now ashen gray. As the front wheels broke the surface, large clumps of earth fell, clouding the lake. Some onlookers instinctively stepped back. The silver sedan, after 11 years buried under Ward Basin, was finally fully revealed. Carson watched without blinking. He noted the mud flaps, the doors, and finally the license plate, missing, either never there or removed before sinking. When the car was placed on a wide clearing near the lake, the forensics team immediately approached, erecting tarps to shield evidence from direct sunlight. Water and mud were gently hosed off with low-pressure nozzles, layers peeled away to reveal the old silver paint, uncannily matching the 2004 description. The rear, despite corrosion, still showed the distinctive curves of an early 2000s sedan model. Carson stepped closer as forensics moved to check the VIN area, the most critical number for identifying the vehicle. But when a technician wiped mud from the VIN stamping location in the engine bay, he immediately stopped and called Carson over. The VIN had been ground off, not by water or time. This was deliberate manual abrasion, done with a sharp tool repeatedly until the metal was smoothed flat. The technician looked at Carson gravely. Someone didn't want this car identified. Carson didn't respond right away. He bent down to examine the scratches closely. These weren't natural corrosion marks underwater. They were cross-grain cuts, multiple layers with varying depths, showing the perpetrator hadn't done it casually, but intentionally erased traces thoroughly. This meant the car hadn't ended up in the lake by accident. It was placed there, and the person who did it had tried to ensure that if found, its identity would be permanently gone. Another diver approached with an initial report: doors locked, windows closed tight, no signs of major external impact, no large dents indicating an accident, no crumpled body from hitting a guardrail. This further supported that the sedan was lowered into the lake controllably. When forensics opened the car doors, thick black mud inside poured out with the water onto the tarp, releasing a pungent, rotten smell from long-decayed materials that forced a few people to step back and adjust their masks. Specialized lights shone into the rear compartment, revealing a scene everyone had silently anticipated, but no one was truly mentally prepared for. Amid the mud, algae, and remnants of rotted interior were two human skeletons overlapping, bones still connected in anatomical structure due to the anaerobic underwater environment preserving them. A moment of dead silence stretched on, as if all sound in the area had been sucked away, leaving only dripping water from the car and heavy breathing from those present. Carson stood a few steps away, staring into the dark interior, a wave of shock forcing him to suppress a deep breath to stay composed. This was no longer an abandoned submerged vehicle. This was the scene of a crime concealed for 11 years. He immediately ordered a full lockdown of the recovery area. Yellow tape was strung in 2 additional perimeters, with officers positioned to control all access points. Less experienced personnel were asked to leave the vicinity to minimize contamination risk. Forensics shifted to high-level scene preservation protocol, erecting larger portable shelters, completely blocking sunlight, and beginning detailed filming from every angle. The 2 skeletons became clearer after surrounding mud was vacuumed with low-power equipment. Long limb bones appeared in sections. Both skulls were fairly intact, only lightly corroded at direct mud contact points. Based on pelvic structure and overall size, a forensic examiner quickly determined both female, consistent with the 2004 missing girls files. But what focused the team intensely was the bodies' positions not aligned with a traffic accident or high-impact crash. One victim lay on her side, back pressed against the rear door, the second slumped forward, as if placed in the back seat while unconscious. That made Carson's skin crawl. A traffic accident wouldn't position 2 girls like that, nor lock the rear doors from outside as confirmed. The initial signs all pointed to one conclusion: they were put in there, not entering voluntarily. While vacuuming floor mud, forensics found front seat belts cut with clean, sharp blade directions. On the rear seat, remaining belt sections were stretched to tearing, as if someone used strong force to secure or manipulate victims. Those details reminded Carson of the 2004 investigation, when they suspected third-party involvement but lacked evidence. Now, that evidence was starkly present. Another examiner gently lifted remaining hair strands near the rear seat base, where mud preserved a few dark brown fibers tangled in metal frames. Though heavily degraded, clearly human hair. As forensics collected all samples for lab analysis, they uncovered another key detail. Wrist bones on both skeletons showed unusual wear, not from water, but pressure from a small cylindrical object, like thin plastic ties or fabric strips. One examiner whispered to Carson, clearly restrained. This nearly immediately ruled out accident. No one ties themselves up, then drives into a lake, especially with the manually abraded VIN, a deliberate trace erasing act. When opening the trunk with specialized tools, forensics found a small mud-covered object, a plastic fragment half the size of a palm. After cleaning, it was identified as remnants of a plastic card, broken, no longer intact. But what stunned Carson was the remaining color, pale blue, matching Florida driver's licenses from 2004. Though unreadable, its presence in the trunk was significant. Forensics continued scanning the front compartment, where steering wheel and dashboard were mostly rotted, but frames intact. Shining specialized lights on the inner door panels revealed tiny speck patterns, An examiner immediately recognized chemical residue from bodily fluids, faint without equipment. Though heavily degraded by time, it was evidence that wouldn't exist in a mere accident and submersion. A rear seat victim in an accident wouldn't leave such marks there. These traces were clearly from injury before sinking. Forensics avoided immediate conclusions, but all indicators leaned toward the girls being assaulted before the car went under. Carson looked at the rotted interior, each detail recounting a long-concealed story. The rear door showed no dents but faint external pull marks, as if someone forced it shut after placing something inside. Forensics noted this immediately. No accident perfectly closes doors during submersion. Only intentional action, as the two skeletons were fully documented and prepared for transport to the lab. An examiner carefully lifted bone sections. Right under the floor, they found a small metal object stuck in mud, a handbag zipper pull, though unconfirmable yet, likely one victim's belonging. The examiners began closing the scene file with preliminary conclusions. Not accident, signs of restraint, signs of assault, vehicle intentionally disposed. Carson stepped back, suppressing a spine-chilling cold. For 11 years, they had nothing, no scene, no evidence, no bodies. And now, the truth buried under Ward Basin's mud was emerging piece by piece, not in meaningless silence, but with clear affirmation. This was murder, no doubt, anymore. Forensics turned to Carson, voice firm without hesitation. We're standing at the scene of an intentionally concealed crime. The two victims didn't die in an accident, they were murdered. Carson took a deep breath, eyes on the silver sedan, still dripping on the ground. For 11 years, the truth lay right under the lake, waiting for the water to drop so it could surface on its own. And in that moment, he knew the investigation he thought was over was only just restarting. The discovery of the two sets of remains in the silver sedan that had been submerged for 11 years under Ward Basin immediately triggered the state-level forensic protocol. The bone fragments, carefully collected from the rear compartment of the vehicle, were sealed in specialized containers, each labeled with a unique identification code, and then loaded into the transport vehicle to the Florida State Medical Examiner's office in Pensacola. Carson accompanied them on that transport, sitting in the back of the van, his eyes constantly fixed on the evidence boxes secured with seat belts, boxes containing the answers he had been seeking for over a decade. He knew that every procedure had to be executed precisely, without error, because the DNA analysis results would be the first step in confirming not only the victims' identities, but also reopening the entire case that had seemed buried forever. Upon arrival at the lab, the forensic team immediately took the bone samples into the cold processing room. A senior state technician, Dr. Kendra Mullen, who had years of experience working with unidentified remains cases, was assigned to handle the DNA extraction. She conducted a preliminary examination of the bone structure before starting the process, assessing bone age, the length of long bones, and pelvic shape. Despite significant decomposition, all indicators matched two young women in their early 20s, exactly the ages of Marina Lopez and Tessa Caldwell when they disappeared in 2004. However, identification through morphology was only a reference step. DNA was the irrefutable evidence. The samples were taken to a specialized cutting chamber to drill into the densest bone, typically the femur and humerus, where DNA was better preserved compared to other parts that had been more exposed to water. Carson observed from behind the anti-contamination glass, feeling each step in the process as if time were slowing down. 11 years of waiting, and now he was just steps away from the truth. As the bone powder was fed into the DNA extraction machine, the gentle hum of the motor spun steadily. This process could take hours, or even days if the samples were severely degraded. But in the anaerobic underwater environment, many old DNA samples had been successfully recovered, and Carson could only hope that would hold true here. Not long after, a preliminary report from the analysis room indicated that the DNA extraction was progressing well, and the bone samples still contained sufficient DNA for comparison. This was the first news that allowed Carson to breathe a little easier, though there was still a long road ahead. Once the DNA was successfully extracted, the samples were fed into the STR analysis system, a highly accurate test used for individual identification and trace comparison in old cases. These STR loci would be directly compared to data from the relatives of Marina and Tessa, who had provided samples back in 2004 when the disappearances were fresh. At that time, the two families' profiles had been entered into CODIS as missing persons reference, though they had never had a chance to be used over the past decade plus. But now, the new bone samples could be the key to reopening the case. Mullen personally operated the analysis system, loading the reference samples into the comparison software. Carson stood nearby, hands clenched, eyes glued to the screen. The data bars appeared gradually, genetic markers running side by side. The lab room was so quiet that Carson could clearly hear the light tapping of a pen on a technician's notepad nearby. Then, the results began to appear line by line: the first STR locus match, the second match, the third match. These markers could not be coincidental. Each matching locus exponentially increased the identification probability to near certainty. When the official results were complete, Dr. Mullen turned the screen toward Carson, her voice firm. The first bone sample matches 99.999%. With the sample from Marina Lopez's mother, there's no doubt. This is Marina. Carson stood still for a few seconds, a heavy sensation washing over him. After 11 years, that girl had finally been found, not in the condition he had once hoped for, but at least her disappearance was no longer an endless question mark. But there was the second sample. Carson said nothing, just nodded slightly to Mullen to continue. The second bone sample was run through the same comparison system as the first. Within minutes, the results were unmistakable. The second bone sample matches perfectly with the sample from Tessa Caldwell's sister. Identification probability at maximum. This is Tessa. That confirmation made Carson close his eyes and take a deep breath. The two victims he had searched for in the final months of 2004, the two names that had haunted him for over a decade, were now identified with undeniable evidence. The two sets of remains in the silver sedan were Marina Lopez and Tessa Caldwell. The news was immediately forwarded to the Santa Rosa County Sheriff's Office, then to Tallahassee and the Cold Case Unit. Per state regulations, any case with new developments involving victim remains must be reopened. And just hours after the DNA results were sent, the missing persons, Lopez and Caldwell file, frozen for 11 years, was officially changed to active homicide investigation. Carson stood on the edge of the lab, looking through the glass at the technicians continuing to analyze materials from the vehicle. Inside him was a mix of relief, pain, and something else. A smoldering anger that he had suppressed 11 years ago for lack of evidence. Now, everything had changed. The two victims had their names back. The car was confirmed to have been deliberately disposed of. Binding marks, signs of assault, scrubbed VIN, locked doors, all pointed in one direction. Someone had murdered the two women and intentionally buried the crime under the lake. The case had been reopened. The investigation was reactivated, and Carson knew that even though 11 years had passed, the road ahead would not be easy. But this time, they had evidence. This time, the truth had surfaced from the water. Immediately after the DNA results confirmed that the two sets of remains in the silver sedan were Marina Lopez and Tessa Caldwell, the entire state forensic team refocused on Ward Basin and the Pensacola lab to proceed with the next step. The sedan, once submerged in cold mud for 11 years, now lay in a fully enclosed examination bay covered by a high white tarp with air filtration fans and specialized lighting illuminating every corner of the decayed interior. Carson stood just outside the perimeter, watching the forensic team in silver-coated gloves and hazmat suits move slowly around this object heavy with truth. The forensics began in the rear compartment, where the two victims were found, since any evidence there was most likely directly related to the process of controlling, confining, or causing their deaths. As they gently removed remaining layers of mud around the seat frames, one technician discovered a long strip adhered under a metal bar, about 4 inches long, encased in mud but still retaining its fibrous structure. After cleaning with a specialized solution, its shape became clear. A piece of gray-silver industrial duct tape, still with tiny dust particles adhered. The presence of duct tape in the rear compartment was not normal, and especially its attachment under the seat frame suggested it had once been fixed to the victims' bodies and then torn or detached when they were placed in the car. A forensic examiner immediately noted in the log, duct tape used to restrict movement. As soon as the tape piece was sealed, another technician called Carson over to see what they had found near the floor, a thin nylon cord, about a handspan long, coiled, as if torn at both ends. Under high light, the breaks in the nylon showed clear friction marks, not from time-induced decay, but from being pulled taut until it snapped. This type of nylon is commonly used in zip ties, small industrial binding cords, or manual wrapping. But what particularly caught the forensic team's attention were the abrasion marks on the wrist bones of both victims, previously noted in the lab. Those abrasions perfectly matched the type of indentations caused by nylon or thin fabric cords. There was no doubt Marina and Tessa had been bound at the wrists while still alive. One forensic examiner continued scanning the front seats and found another piece of nylon cord, smaller, wedged under the driver's seat. Though more decomposed, its structure was sufficient to confirm it was the same material as the one found in the rear. This was not safety belt webbing. It was cord brought in from outside, a clear sign of binding. As the team vacuumed more mud around the passenger seat, a small metal object emerged. After cleaning, it was the pull tab from a zipper belonging to a purse or jacket. However, the abnormality was that it had been forcibly detached from its original object, indicating strong struggling during the incident. Carson observed the entire process with the feeling that each piece was fitting together to sketch the final moments of Marina and Tessa's lives. They had been bound. They had been placed in the rear compartment, not seated voluntarily, and they had no ability to escape. One forensic examiner sat in a position facing the rear to simulate the victim's postures based on bone marks, mud settlement, and interior space. After nearly an hour of reconstruction, the conclusion was clearly noted. Marina's body was tilted to the right, head slumped against the door, a posture indicating she was unconscious or unresponsive before the car sank. Tessa was below, back against the floor, head turned toward the front seats, a posture of being pulled or placed. Neither was in a seated position. They were positioned in the compartment with no signs of resistance movement. This completely ruled out the scenario that they were still conscious inside the vehicle. On the front dashboard, despite heavy damage, forensics still detected a larger patch of tape adhered to the underside of the glove compartment. This patch was different from the type found in the rear, thinner but with signs of being torn from a large roll. This could have been used to gag the victims, as its position corresponded to where the perpetrator might tear tape one-handed while in the driver's or passenger's seat. Upon closer inspection of the front floor, they found another critical piece of evidence. Several tiny fibers, dark blue, caught in a plastic crevice. Under the microscope, the fabric was cotton blended with synthetic fibers, weave patterns similar to men's jacket sleeves. Notably, the fibers were severely stretched, a sign typically seen in direct contact between fabric and rough surfaces, like the seats or interior, when someone reached into the rear. Additionally, using specialized lighting, forensics scanned for microtraces on the front seat surfaces. Though much of the interior had decayed, they still found signs of heavy weight pressing on the passenger seat. Slight but clear indentations. This indicated an adult male or female had sat in the passenger seat while the victims were in the rear. It could not have been Marina or Tessa, as neither victim was in the front per bone positioning. In an instant, everything became clearer. Before the car was dumped in the lake, At least one healthy adult had sat in the passenger seat, with activities involving leaning, reaching, pulling, or pressing on the interior. Even the doors showed handprints embedded in the dried mud on the inside, signs of large hands. These prints retained clear palm edges, something the bound and immobile victims could not have created. The final piece of evidence that made the atmosphere in the examination tent heavy, a short black cloth strip, less than 3 centimeters, adhered to the rear door edge. Upon preliminary examination, it was fabric used in nylon wrist restraints or temporary blindfolds. Though purpose could not yet be confirmed, its smooth, durable nature and horizontal tear indicated it had been pulled taut forcefully. Carson looked at that cloth piece, a chill running down his spine. Every piece of evidence found was telling the same story. Marina and Tessa were not just restrained, they were restrained professionally, with prepared tools, in a process the perpetrator had planned carefully in advance. Nothing was random. Nothing was accidental. And now, with the new evidence collected, duct tape, nylon cords, fabric fibers, pressure marks, pull marks, the picture inside the car had shifted from total darkness to chilling clarity. 2 young women restrained, placed in the rear compartment defenseless, and the sedan dumped to erase all traces. Carson gathered his notes, his hand still trembling slightly. He knew what was coming next, but he also knew the final pieces were starting to appear. While the forensic team continued scanning every centimeter inside the silver sedan, a young technician suddenly called out loudly, his voice mixing with the hum of the mud vacuum and the light scraping of metal tools. "I've got a hair here." Both Carson and Dr. Mullen immediately turned. The hair was discovered at the fold between the rear seat cushion and the door frame, a position rarely preserving biological samples in such long submerged conditions. As the technician lifted it with tweezers, the team held their breath. The hair was long, dark, but most importantly, the root was still intact, though mud-covered. Mullen examined it under a magnifying glass and confirmed what everyone was thinking, but no one dared say too soon. This was a man's hair. Carson said nothing, just felt his heart pounding, as if it would burst from his chest. If this hair was truly foreign, not belonging to Marina or Tessa, then it was the most critical evidence yet. And if the root was intact enough for DNA extraction, they would have the profile of the person who had been inside the car, possibly even the one who killed the 2 women. The hair was immediately placed in a glass vial, triple-sealed, coated, and sent straight to the DNA lab while other samples continued to be collected. Mullen led Carson to the analysis room, where the DNA extraction machine was prepared. All eyes focused on the vial as the cap was opened and the hair placed under the pure white surgical light. Mullen gently cut the root portion, operating with millimeter precision to avoid damaging the remaining cells. As the hair root was fed into the centrifuge, no one spoke. Only the steady hum of the machine remained, a sound that reminded Carson of early 2004 when he had sat in front of outdated equipment, searching for any small clue in the files, hoping for something strong enough to break through. And for 11 years, he had nothing. But now, one hair, just one, could change everything. As the DNA began to extract, the software automatically analyzed the familiar STR marker segments. Each marker appeared on the screen like heartbeats. Long tails, short peaks, distinct branches. The technician typed quickly, running an automated comparison against Marina and Tessa's profiles to rule out contamination. The results appeared just seconds later. No match, meaning the hair did not belong to Marina. The second line, no match, and not to Tessa. A deep silence fell over the room, a silence of truth beginning to surface from the mud, just as the sedan had days before. Mullen looked at Carson. "This is foreign DNA, not from the 2 victims." Carson took a sharp breath. He had known it from the moment he saw the hair, but hearing Mullen confirm it made everything heavier. Mullen continued analyzing the emerging profile, genetic sex, male, full STR consistency, not severely degraded, meaning the sample was high quality enough for a complete DNA profile. As the software reached the final marker, the data was packaged into a DNA profile, a complete genetic identity, ready for CODIS comparison. Mullen printed the preliminary report and placed it in front of Carson. He looked at the long string of genetic numbers on the paper, rows of characters only forensic experts could fully read. But he understood the meaning. This profile was the only path to the person who had been in the car, who had controlled Marina and Tessa, who had dumped the sedan in the lake, who had left exactly one trace that 11 years of mud and water could not erase. A technician suggested, "If we're lucky, he's been arrested in the past or has a record in the system." Mullen nodded, but her eyes cautious. "He might never have been in CODIS. But we still have to try." The Florida CODIS system was opened. A dialog box appeared. "Upload new offender profile." Mullen entered the hair samples identifier, double-scanned the STR string for accuracy, then hit confirm. A short beep sounded. The system began running. A green progress bar appeared, inching up percentage by percentage. Carson stood behind Mullen, holding his breath. 11 years all condensed into this moment. When the bar reached 100%, the screen switched to automatic search mode. Text appeared. Searching. Comparing profile across state and national databases. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Then 5. Everyone in the lab was absolutely silent. Finally, the system turned pale yellow. Text appeared. No direct match found. Offender not in national database. Mullen placed her hand on the desk and sighed. He's never been caught, never entered into CODIS, or he's too good at hiding. Carson gripped his belt tightly, feeling both disappointment and a stronger surge of drive. They didn't know who he was, but now they had his DNA. He was no longer invisible. Mullen turned her chair to Carson. "We can create a complete suspect profile from this hair. Even without a CODIS match, the profile will remain in the system. Any future matching sample will alert immediately." Carson nodded. "So from today, he has a name in our files. Not his real name, but an undeniable identity." Mullen signed the confirmation, and the entry "unknown male." Suspect profile created was added to the system. Below it was the long STR string, the biological identity of a man who once thought he could hide 2 young women forever at the bottom of the lake. In that moment, Carson felt that not only had the car surfaced from the mud, but the truth was surfacing with it. They didn't know who he was yet, but he existed. He had left a trace. And for the first time in 11 years, the investigation was no longer based on vagueness or guesswork, but on something that doesn't lie: the killer's DNA. After obtaining the DNA profile of the unidentified suspect, Carson knew that the investigation could not stop at a no-match result in CODIS. If the DNA was not in the national database, there was only one direction left: to trace back the seemingly meaningless fragments of information from 2004 and cross-reference them using the modern data analysis technology of 2015. Something that he and Hale had not had access to 11 years earlier. Among those old clues, there was one name that had troubled Carson for years: Robert Mason. A name that did not exist in any legal database. A name that the man himself had given at the warehouse in 2004 before disappearing with the 2 girls. A name as empty as a void. But with the advancements in data forensics in 2015, mining rental records, temporary residency information, utility bills, demographic records, even canceled vehicle registration data from previous years, Carson believed that this alias could be exposed if there was enough data to trace. This time, he was not alone. The cold case unit mobilized a small team specializing in temporal data analysis, led by investigator Amelia Brooks, who had previously cracked a series of fake identity cases through digital footprint analysis, even though in the early 2010s, those footprints were still very fragmented. Carson handed Brooks the entire 2004 warehouse file, the guest list, temporary addresses in the area, rental lists within a 5-mile radius, resident records from 2003, 2005, contracts with terms under 12 months, abnormal utility bills, and temporary residency data that the unit had been unable to access at the time. Brooks started by narrowing down those who lived or rented temporarily during the period of the party. The 2015 technology allowed analysis of electricity, water, and internet bills by cycle, cross-referenced with short-term residency conditions, thereby filtering out those who left within 6 months after the event, a group often overlooked by the old administrative systems. When this list was compiled, the initial number was 147 people. Brooks continued filtering using the warehouse witness descriptions, a man with dark hair approximately 30-35 years old in 2004, average to tall height. Though the description was vague, when cross-referenced with ID photos in the driver's license database from that year, the number dropped to 27 people. Carson stood behind Brooks as she further narrowed it down using another criterion: individuals who had used aliases or declared different names in administrative records. This was a feature that did not exist in 2004. Among the 27, 3 had changed names or used names that did not match old records. One was a legal immigrant who changed names per new paperwork. One had been wanted and required an ID change. And the third, Daniel Mercer, had the most unusual history. He had registered a 2-month short-term rental at a motel just 1.2 miles from the warehouse, then left Pensacola in the very week the 2 girls went missing. Carson zeroed in on this name immediately. Mercer, 30 years old in 2004, dark hair about 6 feet tall, had worked seasonally at a small construction company and quit in August of that year. The strange part was that Mercer's residency history before 2004 was extremely vague: no stable rental history, no long-term utility bills, no long-term registrations in any city. He appeared in Pensacola around early 2004, then vanished from the area silently by the end of that year. Brooks dug deeper by pulling the electricity bill data for the room he rented. When analyzing usage in the month the girls went missing, consumption suddenly spiked over 2 consecutive nights, a pattern often seen when someone uses multiple heating devices or runs lights all night. This became even more suspicious when cross-referenced with the motel owner's statement from that year. The tenant in room 7 left without notice, locked the room from the outside. The room had a strange smell, so I threw out all the bedding and cleaned it. The timing of the cleaning matched the period when the 2 victims disappeared. Carson felt a chill down his spine. The story was starting to fit together in an almost unbelievable way. Brooks continued running data on financial transactions in the old files. Mercer did not use credit cards, but paid rent in cash, a habit common among those trying to avoid leaving a banking footprint. State migration data showed Mercer had left Florida 3 times in 2004 by personal vehicle, but those were mandatory reports at interstate toll stations at the time, and the final departure was in October. Just a few weeks after Marina and Tessa vanished, Brooks began building a timeline chart, inputting the facts on the 2004 axis. March, Mercer arrives in Pensacola. June, he moves into the motel near the warehouse. August, he suddenly quits his job. September, the time the 2 girls went missing, he was still in room 7. Late October, he leaves the state, never returns. Carson looked at the chain of events, feeling as if that period was coming alive before his eyes. When Brooks pulled up Mercer's old passport photo on the screen, Carson immediately recognized the key point. The face had the same features that witnesses had described in 2004 when talking about the man who called himself Robert Mason. Not exactly identical, but the sharp jawline, deep-set eyes, and slightly wavy dark hair perfectly matched. Brooks turned the screen. If we follow data logic, Mercer is the last person to use an alias at the warehouse, Carson asked. Do we have evidence that Mercer ever used a fake name? Brooks opened another file. Yes, a 2003 domestic shipping invoice in Jacksonville lists the recipient as Rob Mason, but signed Daniel M. The signature matches 97%. Carson stood frozen for a few seconds. Every piece was locking into place. The alias Robert Mason, the mysterious man leaving the warehouse, the silver car witnesses had seen, Mercer's short-term residency record, his behavior of leaving Pensacola right after the disappearance, abnormal utility traces, and now, evidence he had used Rob Mason before. Brooks turned to Carson, her eyes lighting up. If Mercer lived near the warehouse in 2004, attended the party, used an alias recorded in files, and left the state right when the disappearance happened, then the probability he's that man is nearly absolute. Carson said nothing. He looked back at the unidentified suspect's DNA profile, the cold STR bands on the screen, then at Daniel Mercer's photo printed on the old file. They didn't yet know if that DNA was Mercer's. But now, for the first time in 11 years, they had found the man behind the fake name Robert Mason. Real name, Daniel Mercer. And as Carson slid his finger over the photo of him, he knew the moment of confronting the person who had haunted his entire career was finally drawing near. When the real name of Robert Mason was revealed, Daniel Mercer, Carson felt as if a door that had been sealed shut for over a decade suddenly swung open, leaving a chilling void behind. But identifying Mercer was only the first step. To move toward legal action, they needed to build his behavioral pattern, to prove that Mercer was not just coincidentally in the area, but had a history of similar actions, a pattern showing the perpetrator was not acting for the first time. The cold case unit quickly delved into Mercer's past using 2015 data, and the results made Carson feel like he was reading a different version of what had happened to Marina and Tessa, a terrifying repetition that no one had recognized before. In just 2 days, Brooks discovered that Mercer had been accused by at least 3 women of drugging them at parties and taking them to private locations in 2001, 2003. When he lived in Jacksonville and later Tallahassee. According to the records, the accusers were all women aged 19 to 27, most of whom met Mercer in crowded social settings, bars, parties, or friend gatherings. One of them, per a 2002 report, stated that Mercer tricked her into drinking something that made her pass out minutes later, and when she woke up, her clothes were disheveled, some personal items were missing, and Mercer claimed she had overdrunk. But like many assaults from that era, there were no tests, no cameras, and the victims were ashamed and panicked, leading to cases falling into insufficient evidence. No one was prosecuted. No one was arrested. Mercer vanished from the city just weeks after each accusation. When Brooks presented this report, Carson immediately recognized the all-too-familiar behavioral pattern approaching victims in crowded environments, building trust with smooth talk, taking victims out of public places, using consciousness-altering substances, exploiting them while unconscious, and finally disappearing when suspicion arose. Fear, mixed with anger, choked Carson's voice as he said, "He did this before meeting Marina and Tessa." Brooks nodded. And because no one caught him, he continued. They continued investigating Mercer's residency traces around 2004. One piece of information stunned the team, just 0.9 miles from the warehouse where Marina and Tessa were last seen, was Mercer's rented room. The 2004 Pensacola area map was spread out before Carson, a grid of small streets and sparse industrial zones. When Brooks marked the warehouse location with a pen, then marked the motel where Mercer stayed, the 2 marks were less than a 3-minute drive apart. Carson immediately recalled the 2004 witness statement. He said his name was Robert Mason, said he lived nearby, said he could take the 2 girls to a safer places after the party. Back then, it was just vague testimony. Now, they had his real address, and it matched what he had said. The more they opened Mercer's file, the clearer the pattern became. In the 2004 motel rental application, Mercer had listed a 2001 silver sedan, registered in Tallahassee, but transferred ownership in 2003, before being sold again, and then disappearing from DMV records. The car's color and model closely matched the witness description of the sedan seen at the warehouse. The motor vehicle investigator was assigned to retrieve old registration records and discovered that the silver sedan had undergone an unofficial ownership transfer in mid-2004, but not properly updated. This reminded Carson of the manually scratched VIN on the vehicle salvaged from Ward Basin, a clear attempt to erase any link between the owner and the car, especially if the sedan had been involved in a crime. Mercer's ownership of a silver sedan, disappearing at the same time as the victims, and the car, later found submerged 11 years afterward. It was no longer coincidence. But the most horrifying part didn't stop there. Brooks noticed in Duval County medical records that in 2003, a woman was hospitalized for loss of consciousness for hours after drinking a beverage from a man named Mercer. That girl said that before the incident, Mercer had introduced himself by a different name, Rob M. When Carson heard this alias, he felt like someone had slammed the table. Rob Mason. Mercer had used a version of that fake name before. That time, no DNA was collected. The victim was too shocked to continue accusing. Mercer disappeared. Just as he disappeared from Pensacola in 2004, the cold case unit continued searching Mercer's personal data and found he had no valid driver's license after 2004, but was cited multiple times for traffic violations using unregistered vehicles in 2005, 2006 in Alabama and Tennessee. Each police report noted the same thing: Mercer uncooperative when asked about vehicle ownership. The investigators looked at those descriptions and knew for sure this was not normal behavior. It was the sign of someone accustomed to using fake identities, avoiding traces, and evading the system. But the most crucial data emerged when they cross-referenced interstate migration records. Mercer registered a temporary address change out of Florida on October 18, 2004, exactly 3 weeks after Marina and Tessa went missing. The record was handwritten, not electronic, a common method for those not wanting their migration history tracked too clearly. Brooks placed the copy of that record in front of Carson and said, "He fled," right after the incident. Carson felt rage rising. Mercer had repeated the crime pattern with multiple women. He had used drugs. He had chosen victims in party environments. He had used the fake name Rob Mason. He was in Pensacola at the exact time Marina and Tessa vanished. He lived near the warehouse. He owned a silver sedan. And he left the state right after the crime. The behavioral pattern, link by link, was saying what Carson couldn't prove for 11 years. Mercer acted identically to the perpetrator in the drugging assaults, a pattern not of coincidence, but of habit. When Carson looked at Mercer's photo once more, he no longer saw a vague name in a cold case file. He saw the man who approached the two girls, took them from the warehouse, subdued them, placed them in the sedan's trunk, and pushed the car into Ward Basin to bury the truth. Everything fit. The pattern, the vehicle, the geography, the timing, the behavior, and now, the foreign DNA from inside the car. Carson quietly clenched his fist. Now he was certain they were no longer searching for an undefined name. They were pursuing a man who had existed in the shadows for 11 years, and that shadow finally had a form, a history, a behavior, and a real name: Daniel Mercer. As Mercer's file expanded, and his behavioral pattern matched almost perfectly with the Marina, Tessa case, Carson knew the next step was to find people who had lived with or been in close contact with him during his time in Pensacola in 2004. In Mercer's motel rental record, just under a mile from the warehouse, there was a detail overlooked in the original investigation: the name of a co-tenant, faintly scribbled at the bottom of the contract in messy handwriting: Evan Price. Back in 2004, when the disappearance was fresh, police had located Price. But at that time, no bodies, no car, no evidence. Mercer used aliases, and Price said he barely remembered anything about the roommate for those few months. The record captured just 3 lines. Price said Mercer was quiet, often worked nights, didn't interact much, saw nothing unusual, and it stopped there. But in 2015, with forensic data exposing who Mercer was and foreign DNA in the car proving a man's presence at the crime scene, Carson knew it was time to find Evan Price again. Price now lived in Mobile, Alabama, about a 90-minute drive from Pensacola. Over 10 years had passed. He was married, had 2 young children, and worked for a shipping company. When Carson and Brooks knocked on his door, Price opened it with surprise mixed with wariness. He was no longer the 20-year-old from back then, now a man in his 30s, looking weary like someone carrying heavy responsibilities. Carson showed him credentials and said directly, "We're reinvestigating the Marina Lopez and Tessa Caldwell case." Price immediately stepped back half a pace. In that moment, Carson knew there was something Price hadn't said in 2004 or had lied about. The interview was conducted at the Mobile PD office per proper procedure. Price appeared cooperative but clearly tense, hands clasped, collar slightly damp with sweat. Carson started with the familiar question, "What do you remember about Daniel Mercer from that time?" Price frowned, trying to stick to the old story. "I already said. I don't remember much. He only stayed a few months. We barely saw each other." But Brooks placed the 2004 rental contract copy in front of him, with Price's signature, a looping P, that matched perfectly with his 2010 tax document signature. Price looked down, realizing they had grounds for confrontation. Carson continued, "You and Mercer lived together during the time the two girls went missing. Did you ever see him use the name Robert Mason when meeting strangers?" Price flinched, 1 second, then 2. He hesitated before saying, "That name, I heard him say it once, but I don't remember clearly." The answer sounded like partial truth mixed with evasion. Brooks flipped to more evidence, the 2003 shipping invoice with Rob Mason signed in handwriting, similar to Mercer's. When the document was placed before him, Price turned his face away, hands clenching tightly. Carson noticed that reaction, as if buried memories were cracking open inside him. Carson lowered his voice, but emphasized each word. "Evan, you said you remembered nothing in 2004, but we know Mercer used aliases before, and a male hair in the victim's car shows he didn't act alone in the preparation. I need you to tell the truth." Price's eyes widened at Carson. "Hair in the car? You found the car?" Carson didn't answer. He just closed the file folder and said, "You don't need to know what you don't need to know, but you need to tell the truth about Mercer." Silence stretched on, Price staring at the table, eyes darting intensely. Clearly, he knew more than he had said in 2004. And in 2015, unlike 11 years earlier, Carson had too much evidence to break through his defenses. Brooks pressed further with something Price couldn't dodge. The motel utility bills. Why did electricity usage in room 7 double over 2 consecutive nights, exactly when the two girls went missing? Price suddenly trembled. He swallowed hard. I don't know. I wasn't there all the time." "Did you see Mercer return to the room that night?" Price looked away, no longer hiding his tension. "No, not exactly. I mean, he came back late. I didn't notice." But that was the worst answer he could give. Vague and easily refuted. Carson pushed another file forward. Confirmation that Price had missed work for 2 days after the disappearance, completely contradicting his 2004 statement that he went to work as usual. Price went pale, clearly not expecting old personnel records to still exist. "You lied to the police," Carson said bluntly, voice not harsh but heavy like placing a stone on the table. "Why?" Price clenched his hands so tightly that his knuckles turned white. In that moment, his gaze was no longer that of a witness trying to evade, but of a man pushed by memories to his absolute limit. Sensing the imminent breakdown, Carson lowered his voice and gently pushed one step further. "Evan, you've carried this for 11 years, and 2 girls died without anyone speaking up for them. If there's ever a time to tell the truth, it's now." Price shuddered, his hands clutching his head, as if trying to hold the fragments of memory from shattering apart. His breathing came in gasps, like someone who had just surfaced from icy water. Then, like a valve suddenly wrenched open, he began to speak, slowly at first, then faster, layer after layer of secrets, peeling away as though he had been waiting for this day for a long time. "That night, the day they disappeared, I knew they were in the apartment." Carson leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "You saw them?" Price nodded sharply, his eyes red. "Not clearly with my own eyes, but I heard sounds. Women's sounds, muffled, heavy noises. I knew he had brought them back." Brooks immediately asked, "You're certain both victims were in Mercer's apartment?" Price clenched his fists until his knuckles went white. "Certain, no mistake. I heard high heels scraping against the tile floor, sounds a man wouldn't make. Then gasping breaths, thumps against the wall. He didn't know I was still awake. Carson took notes, then asked softly, "What did he do?" Price swallowed hard. "He assaulted them. I heard him yelling, heard him dragging someone. Both of them. I knew because there were two different voices, one panicked and the other hoarser." The room fell dead silent. Brooks stopped writing. Carson stopped moving. Price continued, his voice choking in his throat. "Mercer used drugs. I don't know what, but I'd seen him mix something into drinks a few times before. He once bragged to me that just one sip and she won't be able to stand anymore. I didn't believe it then. But that night, I heard them collapse to the floor." Carson gave a cold smile, not from joy, but from rage finally confirmed. This was the exact pattern Mercer had used for years. Price went on, his voice trembling like a man confessing his own guilt. "I didn't dare come out. I only peeked through the door crack when he wasn't looking. I saw him. He was tying their hands with nylon cord, pulling so hard their wrist turned red. He stuffed duct tape into one woman's mouth. The other couldn't even fight back." Brooks scribbled furiously, his face paling because what Price described perfectly matched the ligature marks and duct tape residue recovered from the car. "After that," Price continued, "he dragged them outside, but not like normal people. He dragged them with both hands, one at a time, like dragging bags. I heard bodies scraping down the stairs." Carson asked immediately, "Whose car?" Price didn't hesitate. "Mercer's, the silver sedan." I clearly remember the sound of the car door, the metal creak. He opened the back door. I heard him heavily lifting something into the car. I knew it was them. Another silence enveloped the room. Price took a deep breath, then revealed the detail Carson hadn't expected, but knew was coming. He came back to the apartment about 20 minutes later. He came into my room. I pretended to be asleep, but he shook me awake. He said, "I need you, right now." I didn't dare resist. Brooks froze. "He forced you to help dispose of the bodies?" Price nodded, his eyes reliving images he had tried to forget for 11 years. "He took me down to the car. I saw the trunk area covered with a blanket, but I knew what was underneath. I saw hair, just a little, sticking out from the edge of the blanket. He cursed at me for staring too long." "Carson, what did he say?" "He said, 'If you ever open your mouth to anyone, you'll go with them.' And I believed him. I'd lived with him for 3 months. I knew he wasn't bluffing." Carson struggled to stay calm. "You helped him drive the car where?" Price squeezed his eyes shut, as if trying to erase the memory, but it clung to him like spreading ink. "He drove. I sat in the passenger seat. I clearly remember the smell of bleach in the car. He had cleaned something, or tried to wipe it away. After a while we left the city, heading toward Ward Basin. I asked why that direction. He cursed, and told me to shut up." Brooks interjected, "You personally saw him dispose of the car?" Price shook his head. "He wouldn't let me get out of the car. He told me to watch the road, but from a distance, I heard the engine revving hard, then a loud splash of water. He pushed the car from a sloping embankment into the lake." Carson felt a chill down his spine. The detail perfectly matched the minor dent on the car's rear. Price continued, "He came back covered in mud. He wasn't panicked, like he had done this before. He only said one thing, 'It's done. Never speak about tonight.' Then he forced me into that damn oath I've carried for 11 years. Carson leaned back in his chair, his fingers trembling slightly from suppressed rage. This was the testimony he had waited for through nearly half his career in law enforcement. Brooks stated flatly, "You know you're confessing to participating in evidence tampering." Price nodded firmly, his hands clenched so tight the veins stood out. "I know, and I'll take responsibility. But I didn't hurt them. Mercer did. I was just the coward who didn't stop him." Carson looked straight at Price, his gaze both steel cold and carrying the exhaustion of 11 years. "Evan, your statement will change this entire case, but from now on you have to tell the truth. Every detail." Price nodded, for the first time without evasion or hesitation. "I'll tell everything, all of it. Nothing held back." And in that moment, Carson understood. The veil covering the night Marina and Tessa disappeared had finally been torn away by Price. His testimony, combined with the DNA in the car, combined with Mercer's long-standing pattern of behavior, all of it now formed a complete map leading straight to the killer. The crime buried for 11 years at the bottom of the lake had begun to surface, layer by layer, unstoppable. Once Evan Price's statement was fully recorded and cross-referenced with the foreign DNA in the car, with the physical evidence recovered from the trunk, and with Mercer's behavioral history, the cold case unit immediately moved to the critical phase, reconstructing the entire timeline of the night of September 24, 2004, the night Marina Lopez and Tessa Caldwell disappeared. This task was assigned to 3 coordinated teams: the Forensic Evidence Team, the 2004-2015 Telecommunications Data Analysis Team, and the Vehicle Travel Team. Carson stood at the center of the conference room in the Santa Rosa County Sheriff's Office as specialists spread out maps, crime scene photos, charts, and hundreds of pages of analysis across the long table. The goal: close every single minute, proving not only Mercer's presence, but his criminal actions. Forensics began with DNA, the undeniable factor. In the silver sedan, salvaged from Ward Basin, they recovered complete DNA profiles of both victims on the car floor. Foreign male DNA that did not match any profile in CODIS. Male hairs stuck in the rear seat crevice, with intact roots containing DNA that matched Mercer's profile from an old civil record. The 99.999% match ended all debate. The DNA in the car was Mercer's. Next, forensics analyzed mechanical evidence. Nylon cord with cuts from forceful pulling, matching the ligature marks on both victims' wrist bones. Silver-gray duct tape, same brand and production period as the roll found among Mercer's abandoned belongings in his 2004 rental. Dark blue fabric fibers, matching the material of the work jacket Mercer wore in his 2004 construction company ID photo. Indentation on the front passenger seat, consistent with a man weighing approximately 170-190 pounds. Minor dent on the rear of the vehicle, consistent with the mechanism of pushing the car from behind in the Ward Basin embankment simulation. All the evidence combined painted one single picture: Mercer was not only present in the car, but directly tied, controlled, and disposed of the victims. Forensics then moved to the cause of death, searching for indirect signs from the heavily decomposed bodies. The Pensacola Medical Examiner's report noted, no major bone fractures from a traffic accident. No typical skull trauma from high-speed impact. No signs of attempting to escape the vehicle. This completely ruled out the possibility of an accidental car plunge into the lake. The 2 women were not unconscious from an accident or drowning. They were already unconscious or restrained to the point of no response before the car sank. Forensic conclusion: cause of death, highly likely oxygen deprivation in a confined space or intoxication from an anesthetic substance, unable to determine precisely due to elapsed time, but signs of restraint were clear. After finalizing the forensic portion, Carson directed the 2015 data analysis team to re-examine 2004 cell tower records, which had previously been underutilized due to technological limitations. This time, with new resolution software, they could review raw ping signals from Marina's and Tessa's phones on the night of disappearance. Although 2004 lacked GPS or real-time location, occasional pings when phones searched for signal were located in 3 areas: the warehouse party in Pensacola, the residential area near Mercer's rental, pings overlapping between 3 o'clock, 3:30 a.m., the vicinity of Highway 90 toward Ward Basin, final ping at 4:10 a.m. The timing of the last ping before the phones went dead matched almost perfectly with Price's statement that Mercer left the rental and drove toward Ward Basin near dawn. This was not coincidence. It was historical location data confirming the perpetrator's route. Next, the vehicle travel team simulated the route from the warehouse to Mercer's rental and then to Ward Basin. They calculated time Mercer approached the victims as the party ended, estimated 1:45, 2 a.m. Travel time from warehouse to rental, 6-8 minutes. Time to subdue and bind victims, 1-2 hours. Drive time to Ward Basin 18-22 minutes. Disposal time 10-15 minutes. Total 2 hours 30 minutes to 3 hours, perfectly matching the cell tower pings at 3:30 and 4:10. Forensics then combined all data to create the most detailed reconstructed timeline since 2004. Reconstructed timeline, 1:45, 2 a.m. Marina and Tessa leave the warehouse with Mercer, per witness descriptions, 2:10, 2:20. Mercer brings them to his nearby rental. Price hears footsteps and yelling. 2:20, 3 o'clock, Mercer drugs, assaults, and binds their hands with nylon cord, gags them with duct tape. High heel scraping and wall thumps, confirmed by Price, 3 o'clock, 3:30. Mercer drags both victims to the parking lot, places them in the silver sedan trunk. Body positions and seat traces match Price's description. 3:30 cell tower ping in the residential area, near the rental, confirms victims' phones still in that zone. 3:40, 4:05, Mercer and Price drive the sedan toward Ward Basin. Price in passenger seat, seat indentation, matching his weight. 4:10 final victim phone ping appears near Ward Basin. 4:15, 4:30, Mercer pushes the car into the lake by hand. Rear dent consistent with shallow impact at embankment edge. After 4:30, Mercer and Price leave the scene, return to the rental. Mercer cleans traces. Late October 2004, Mercer flees the state. Immigration traces show deliberate disappearance per plan. The reconstruction was presented as a 3D simulation with 2004 night maps, recreating street lighting, sounds, routes, vehicle speeds, and ping times. When the simulation reached the segment of Mercer dragging the victims to the car, Carson stared at the rough, grim imagery. It captured exactly the night he had tried to crack for over a decade. Finally, as the simulation ended with the sedan lurching and sliding into the dark water, the conference room fell silent. No blind spots remained. No gaps, no unexplained minute. The crime had been rebuilt from the lake bottom, from the mud, from DNA, from buried testimony, from technology that did not exist in 2004. Carson exhaled, not from relief, but because he knew the investigation had entered an irreversible phase. They had closed the timeline. And the only person appearing in every link, from the warehouse, the rental, the back seat, to the lake's edge, was one Daniel Mercer. Once the 2004 crime timeline was completely closed, and every link pointed directly to a single individual, Daniel Mercer, the cold case unit moved to the decisive phase, arresting the suspect. By tracing residency records from the years after 2004, they determined Mercer had moved through multiple states, Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, before settling stably in Sarasota, Florida, where he lived under an ordinary name, did odd jobs at a car repair garage, and rented a small house in a sparsely noticed suburban area. His pattern of constant movement over a decade showed he was always nervously afraid the past would catch up, but after 11 years, he believed everything had been completely buried beneath Ward Basin. In reality, the very car he had dumped that year had resurfaced to drag him toward the blade of justice. On the day the arrest warrant was signed, Carson personally led his team to Sarasota. The operation was deployed discreetly, 2 unmarked cars, support from the local sheriff's office, and a remote SWAT team ready in case Mercer attempted to flee. The house he lived in was tucked in an old neighborhood, with a rotting wooden fence and a front yard full of dry leaves, exactly the kind of place someone wanting to disappear would choose. Carson observed through binoculars and saw Mercer's old pickup truck parked in the driveway. No other people, no sounds except the faint whir of a fan inside. When the moment was right, Carson signaled. The team advanced in absolute silence. 2 agents circled to the back door. 2 others approached the front. Carson stood just to the right of the door, his voice firm but not loud. "Sheriff's office, Daniel Mercer." "Open the door." A long silence followed. Then slow footsteps, unhurried, as if Mercer had just been woken up and nothing alarmed him. The door opened slightly. Mercer stood there, hair longer than in the 2004 photos, unevenly shaved beard, deep-set eyes, cheeks sunken from years of hiding, but Carson immediately recognized the same gaze. The one witnesses had described at the warehouse: cold, observant, emotionless. "Who are you?" Mercer asked, voice hoarse, eyes glancing past Carson at the others. Carson held up the warrant. "Daniel Mercer, you are under arrest for the murders of Marina Lopez and Tessa Caldwell on September 24, 2004. In that moment, Mercer did not flinch, did not panic, did not run. Only raised an eyebrow slightly, as if hearing an old story unrelated to him. But his hands clenched very lightly, enough for Carson to notice his body tensing in defensive reflex. Two agents stepped forward and cuffed him before he could do anything unexpected. Mercer did not resist, but neither did he cooperate. He stood still, his eyes barely acknowledging the men leading him to the car. As he was placed in the vehicle, Carson saw in his eyes not fear, but calculation, as if he were gauging how much they knew. And that only reinforced the danger he had once posed. While Mercer was transported, the search team executed the house warrant. The small house was cluttered: car repair tools, old clothes, scattered papers. But in the back room, they found two unexpected pieces of evidence: a roll of silver-gray duct tape, same brand and production era as the roll found in Mercer's 2004 rental belongings, and perfectly matching the tape residue recovered in the victim's car. Thin white nylon cord, industrial type, partially cut and coiled in a wooden box. This evidence was nearly identical to the severed nylon cord found in the silver sedan's trunk. As the forensic team seized the items, Brooks said quietly, "He thought he'd gotten away." He never imagined these things would come back to tie him to a crime from 11 years ago. Also in that room, they found an old metal box containing a few personal items: papers, old IDs from multiple states, some photos of Mercer when younger. One of them stunned Carson: a picture of him standing next to the 2001 silver sedan, with a forced smile and eyes no different from now. Though faded, the body lines, paint color, and wheel style were identical to the sedan salvaged from Ward Basin. Brooks held the photo close to Carson's face. "This is direct confirmation." Carson only nodded, feeling the truth closing around Mercer like iron bars. As the search continued, they found no physical traces of the victims, no jewelry, no clothing fragments, no personal items. Mercer had clearly erased everything related to Marina and Tessa long ago, but the duct tape and nylon cord alone were enough. They not only confirmed the behavioral pattern, but matched the evidence still present in the car. When Carson entered the interrogation room, Mercer was already seated, cuffed, but his body relaxed as if unconcerned. The light illuminated his face, highlighting dark eyes and unkempt mustache. Carson placed the file on the table, unopened, and simply said, "We found the silver sedan." Mercer did not blink. "What car?" Carson continued, word by word, giving him no room to deny. "Your car. The one you pushed into Ward Basin. The one with two bodies inside." Mercer leaned back in the chair, offering a faint smile almost indistinguishable from a smirk. "I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't kill anyone. I don't know those two girls." Carson opened the file and pulled out crime scene photos. Mercer glanced at them, then looked away, expression unchanged. "You're sure you never met Marina Lopez?" "Mercer, never." "Or Tessa Caldwell?" "No." Carson placed the DNA profile next to Mercer's photo. "Your DNA on the back seat." Mercer curled his lip. "Oh, DNA can be contaminated. That car could have been staged by someone. I'm not involved." Brooks, watching from behind the one-way glass, gave Carson a knowing look. Mercer would deny to the end. He had done it with accusations in 2001, 2002, 2003, and escaped. He believed he could escape again. Carson closed the file and said the words he knew would echo in court later: "You can deny it. But Ward Basin won't, and the car won't, and the nylon cord won't, and the duct tape won't." Mercer folded his arms, his eyes darkening. "I want a lawyer." Carson stood, looking at him one last time. "Of course, you'll need more than one lawyer." Mercer was led away, still wearing his defiant smile. But for Carson and the entire cold case unit, this arrest marked what they had waited 11 years for. The perpetrator had finally been dragged out of the shadows. Immediately after Mercer was arrested in Sarasota and the evidence from his home was seized, the entire focus shifted to the most critical phase, preparing for trial. A case buried for 11 years, with no direct eyewitnesses, no confession, and bodies discovered in an advanced state of decomposition. Bringing Mercer to trial required a complete airtight case file with no gaps that the defense attorney could exploit. The Santa Rosa County Prosecutor's Office set up a dedicated conference room for the task force, and Carson and Brooks attended nearly all the discussions. Lead prosecutor, Lorraine Harker, renowned for her ability to turn difficult cases around simply by logically arranging even the smallest pieces of evidence, received Carson's nearly 3-inch thick case file. After 48 hours of reading through the night, she concluded, "We have a case that not only has evidence, but also has a story. And that story is very clear. Mercer did this." Harker divided all the evidence into 5 major groups, each reinforced with its own logical loop, but when combined, they formed an unbreakable steel structure. 1. Forensic, physical traces from the sedan. Harker requested that the forensics team produce a linear report in which all physical evidence had to prove Mercer's actions in sequence. When pieced together, they had DNA from Marina and Tessa on the floor and rear seats, Mercer's extraneous DNA on the front seats, rear seats, and in hair strands, nylon cord of the same type as that found in Mercer's home, gray duct tape of the same brand and production period found in his room, cut marks on the cord matching the abrasion marks on the victim's wrist bones, dent on the rear of the vehicle consistent with the mechanism of pushing the car into the lake, body positions inconsistent with any form of accident. The forensic report was described by the prosecution as the backbone of the case, unbreakable and undeniable. 2. Testimony of Evan Price, the only surviving link. Price, after obtaining legal representation and undergoing multiple formal interrogations, signed a 42-page statement detailing everything he witnessed on the night of the crime, the 2 victims being brought into Mercer's room, sounds of struggling women's shoes falling, Mercer tying their hands with nylon cord and gagging them with duct tape, Mercer demanding Price help dispose of the car, Price standing watch while Mercer pushed the car into Ward Basin. This testimony not only filled major gaps in the sequence of events, but also matched perfectly with all forensic evidence, something Harker believed would make it nearly impossible for the jury to doubt its authenticity. 3. DNA. The drill piercing through every denial. The prosecution determined, no matter how much Mercer denied it, his DNA in the rear compartment of the car was evidence that could not be explained innocently. Harker ordered expanded analysis to confirm no possibility of cross-contamination, and the results showed Mercer's profile appearing on 3 surfaces in the car, in 3 different locations, one of which was deep under the seat cushion, where cross-contamination was impossible. If he had never been in the rear, Harker said, his DNA wouldn't have magically climbed in there. 4. Timeline. Matching every minute. The team constructed a timeline presented in graphic style, colors, maps, time markers, and cell tower pings. It proved that Mercer met the 2 girls at the warehouse, returned to the motel at the exact time Price heard noises, left the motel and traveled the exact route to Ward Basin. Cell pings confirmed the car was at the right place at the right time. This timeline was considered the crime map that no defense attorney could dismantle without creating unrealistic gaps. 5. Behavioral pattern. Mercer was not a first-timer. Harker decided to include in the file the behavioral pattern section from 3 women who had accused Mercer before 2004. Although they were not victims of this case, their testimonies showed Mercer had a history: approaching women at parties, drugging them, assaulting them while unconscious, using fake names Rob or Mason, disappearing from the area when suspected. The fact that the man from 2001-2003 behaved identically to the man in 2004 created a continuous behavioral trail, preventing Mercer from escaping with arguments of no motive or mistaken identity. When all 5 evidence groups were assembled, Harker organized an internal presentation for Carson, Brooks, and the cold case unit to review the trial mock-up. She opened her laptop and displayed the first slide, State of Florida versus Daniel Mercer. A case resurrected by truth, science, and time. In 20 minutes, Harker presented the entire journey from the warehouse, the apartment, the sedan, Ward Basin Lake, DNA, Price's testimony, to Mercer's arrest. When the final slide closed with the image of the mud-covered car in the salvage yard, the room fell silent for a few seconds. No one spoke, not because they lacked words, but because everyone felt that this 11-year-old case file was not only airtight but impenetrable. Mercer could deny it to the police. He could remain silent in interrogation. But when he entered the courtroom, he would face forensic science, time, and evidence that doesn't lie. And the prosecution was ready. As the trial prepared to begin, Prosecutor Lorraine Harker knew that one of the most important keys to breaking through Mercer's cold wall of denial was the behavioral pattern. The repeated chain of actions in the years before the Marina and Tessa case. But to admit this evidence in court as pattern evidence, she needed flesh and blood witnesses, the women who had escaped Mercer before he caused the 2004 tragedy. And what surprised Carson was that they agreed to appear. Those women had lived for years in fear, feeling they had escaped, but never truly safe. They had feared the police wouldn't believe them, feared being blamed, feared reliving the horrific memories. But when they learned Mercer had been arrested, when they learned the bodies of the 2 girls had been found after 11 years, they decided to do what they couldn't in 2001, 2002, and 2003, speak up. Harker collected statements from 3 women who had never met each other, never known each other, but whose stories were chillingly similar. The first was Julia M., now 33 years old. Julia recounted in tears that in 2001, at a college party in Jacksonville, Mercer introduced himself as Rob Mason, wearing a dark green jacket and flashing an overly confident smile. He offered her a cocktail. Just 10 minutes later, Julia felt her legs give way. She remembered leaning against the wall, and then only blurry images of Mercer leading her away from the crowd, saying, "It's too noisy here. Let me take you somewhere safe." That was the pattern of isolating the victim from friends, something Price heard when the 2004 victims were pulled into the motel room. Julia woke up in a dark room, clothes disheveled, body aching. Mercer sat a few steps away, looking at her with eyes cold as stone. She screamed. He lunged and gagged her with gray-silver duct tape. Julia luckily escaped when he slipped, hitting his head on the table while trying to pull her back. The second was Rachel T., who met Mercer at a music event in Tallahassee. She described how he always appeared alone, targeting women who were separated, always knowing when to strike when they were apart from the group. Rachel said she only drank half the water he gave her before her body felt like melted rubber. She woke up in Mercer's room with her hands tied with white nylon cord, the same type that appeared in Marina and Tessa's car. Rachel struggled and bit Mercer's hand, causing him to lose control for a few seconds, enough for her to free herself and run out. But when she reported to the police, they couldn't prove anything beyond her statement. The third was Hannah, who worked at a bar Mercer frequented. She described him as the guy waiting on the edge of the crowd, not drinking, not smiling, just observing. One night as Hannah walked to the parking lot after work, Mercer suddenly appeared behind her, blocking her path and trying to pull her into his silver sedan. Hannah scratched his face hard and escaped. The next day, he vanished from the city. These testimonies, though from different times and places, matched at key points. Mercer used the fake name Rob Mason, or variations. He drugged victims with drinks. Or he isolated them from the crowd and took them to his private apartment. He used gray duct tape to gag them. He used thin nylon cord to tie hands. One suspected, he immediately left the city. Harker understood that to admit this behavioral pattern in court, she had to prove the similarities were not coincidence, but repeated psychological and behavioral signature behavior. When Mercer's legal team filed a motion to exclude, arguing the old incidents were irrelevant and potentially prejudicial. Harker countered with a 72-page legal brief, writing, "If one person uses the same method to approach, control, and assault multiple women in different years, and the two victims in this case were assaulted in exactly that pattern, then pattern evidence is not only admissible, but essential to establishing intent and capability." The judge, after reviewing the forensic file, timeline, Price's testimony, and the three women's statements, ruled the prior witnesses' pattern testimony was admitted as evidence of intent and pattern. Carson read the ruling and felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. For years, Marina and Tessa could not speak about how they met him, but now, the women who escaped him would speak for them, and the court would listen. Harker looked at Carson in the preparation room and said, "Men like Mercer don't commit crime once, they commit until they're caught, and this time, he won't disappear again." On the day the trial opened, the Santa Rosa County courtroom was packed to the point of adding extra seating. Many in the community who remembered the 2004 disappearance came because they wanted to hear the truth that for 11 years, they had only known through rumors. Mercer was led into the courtroom in an orange prison jumpsuit, his face expressionless as if he had no emotional nerves. He sat between two officers, arms crossed, staring straight ahead without glancing at Carson, the man who had pursued him for a decade. Prosecutor Lorraine Harker opened with a sharp, unembellished statement, no exaggeration, no drama, just evidence-based. "We will prove that Daniel Mercer met Marina Lopez and Tessa Caldwell at the Pensacola warehouse, took them to his motel room, drugged them, restrained them, bound them, and then disposed of them by pushing his silver sedan into Ward Basin Lake. We have forensics, we have testimony. We have a timeline. We have a behavioral pattern." The defense objected vigorously, trying to assert the case had no direct eyewitness, that DNA could be cross-contaminated, that Evan Price is an unreliable witness. But right from the first day of trial, those efforts were bent by physical evidence. The forensic expert was called to the stand, presenting a series of images: Mercer's rooted hair under the seat crevice, his DNA at 3 points in the vehicle compartment, wrist marks perfectly matching the sample nylon cord seized from his home. The defense attorney tried to attack, "Is it possible the hair fell into the car at a different time?" The expert smiled faintly. The car was underwater for 11 years. Mercer couldn't accidentally drop hairs into a sealed compartment, submerged the whole time. There's only one possibility. His hair was in the car before it was disposed of. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. By the third day, the most critical witness appeared, Evan Price. He entered the courtroom tense, but no longer trembling, as during interrogations. After swearing in, he looked directly at the prosecution and recounted the entire horrific night of 2004. Price's voice was low, steady, unflinching. "I heard them in the room. 2 women's voices, I heard Mercer tying them. I saw the nylon cord, I saw the duct tape. He forced me to go along, I saw him put them in the car. I stood watch while he pushed the car into the lake." Mercer's attorney attacked fiercely. "What do you gain from saying this? Were you coerced? Are you afraid of being charged so you're blaming my client?" Price responded with one sentence that silenced the room. "I'm telling the truth, and I've been lying for 11 years. Every night I hear their voices in my sleep. This is the first chance I've had to make it right." Harker said nothing more. She knew the testimony carried its own weight, but what truly broke Mercer was not Price's testimony, but the pattern evidence from the 3 women who escaped him. Each took the stand on the 5th day of trial, and their stories matched to the point the jury could not deny the similarities. Drugged, led away from the group, taken to the apartment, hands tied with nylon, mouth gagged with gray duct tape, assaulted while unconscious. When the final witness, Hannah, stood and pointed directly at Mercer, her voice clear, "He tried to pull me into his silver sedan. I was lucky to escape." Marina and Tessa were not. Mercer finally wavered. He clenched his jaw, hands gripping the chair until veins bulged on his wrists, but still not a word. In closing arguments, Harker spoke for 14 minutes. Concise, precise, no circumlocution. Forensics speaks. DNA speaks. Nylon cord speaks. Duct tape speaks. Cell towers speak. Timeline speaks. And Evan Price speaks. The victims who escaped him also speak. The only one who says nothing is Daniel Mercer. But silence is not evidence of innocence. Silence is his choice. Evidence chooses truth. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The foreperson stood, holding the paper that had waited 11 years to be read. As to the charge of murder in the first degree for Marina Lopez, we find guilty. A sob escaped from the back row. As to the charge of murder in the first degree for Tessa Caldwell, we find guilty. Mercer did not move, only staring into empty space. The judge banged the gavel, voice grave. Daniel Mercer, you are sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Carson closed his eyes for a second. 11 years, 2 victims, 1 perpetrator. And justice finally rang out in that room, clear, cold, irreversible. When the life sentence for Daniel Mercer was pronounced and he was escorted out of the courtroom, Carson stood alone in the courthouse hallway, feeling something he no longer thought he could reach after more than a decade: closure. Not relief, not triumphant joy, but the sense that he had finally brought the names Marina Lopez and Tessa Caldwell out of the darkness of untold stories, restoring to them the voice that had been buried under the waters of Ward Basin for 11 years. Throughout the entire 11-year investigation into the Marina Lopez and Tessa Caldwell case, one thing stood out. The crime occurred in the briefest moments, and the consequences of a lack of vigilance or self-protection tools can last nearly a lifetime. The story has many layers of lessons directly relevant to life in the United States today, especially as issues like violence against women, date rape, drugs, and the dangers of predators in party environments continue to be widely discussed. Marina and Tessa disappeared just moments after leaving the warehouse, with a man calling himself Robert Mason, a fake name later identified as Daniel Mercer. The frightening part is that he was not immediately suspicious, well-dressed, good at conversation, creating a sense of safety. This reflects an important reality: dangerous people don't always look dangerous, and in party settings, whether in Los Angeles, New York, or Florida, no one can rely solely on intuition for safety. Mercer's pattern of drugging, isolating victims from their group, taking them to a private apartment, and using duct tape and nylon cord to restrain them, was described by many other women. It was not impulsive but a deliberate sequence of behavior, something communities in the U.S. today, especially young women, need to understand. Such criminals hunt opportunities, not random pursuits. Another key lesson is the power of technology and data sharing. In 2004, the lack of GPS, cameras, and cell tower analysis capability caused the case to stall. But by 2015, just one hair, a faint phone ping, and forensic advances were enough to overturn the crime. This underscores the importance of enabling location sharing with trusted friends, saving travel routes, and not turning off phones when going out at night, small habits that can decide life or death. Finally, Evan Price's testimony shows that prolonged silence can kill justice. Many people in the U.S. today, whether neighbors, friends, or indirect witnesses, still choose silence out of fear of trouble. But the truth is, Price's silence prolonged the pain of 2 families for a decade. The story reminds us that sometimes speaking the truth, even late, is still the right thing to do. Thank you for following the entire journey to rediscover the truth after 11 years submerged in darkness. If you found it meaningful, please subscribe to join us for the next stories. See you in the next video, where we continue to open files that seemed forever closed, but still wait to be told.